Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. July 2, 2001 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, King of the Ring Review, Raw to become WCW branded, more by Dave Meltzer. With the business at a crossroads, Vince McMahon made the ultimate ballsy move. Starting in just a few weeks, unless plans change, and they do on a daily basis, Raw on TNN will be renamed WCW Raw. TNN officially got the word on June 22, although McMahon had the basic ideas formulated many weeks ago of having one existing primetime show be labeled with the WCW brand and the other be a WWF brand. McMahon's feelings were that WWF versus WCW will have to be promoted as both being equals to be able to create a separate entity and drive the same type of successful revenue streams when it comes to merchandising, licensing, ticket selling and pay-per-view as the WWF. As negotiations fell through for the original 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. time slot on Saturday nights on TNN, McMahon said he felt that even if those negotiations hadn't fallen through, if WCW was given that time slot, it would immediately establish them as a secondary company. There was also the question of adding another $350,000 weekly expense as well as the time constraints problem on a busy staff for a third day every week of taping new television. Exactly how the storyline explaining this will go is uncertain, but there are basic plans. The idea is that when Shane gets control of Raw, that it will be the big prize because it signifies that in the end, Vince lost the all-important Monday Night War, not to Ted Turner, but to Shane, theoretically establishing him and his team as big players for taking the thing Vince worked for the hardest away from him. WWF will use SmackDown as its primary outlet. While Raw is seen by many as the priority of the two shows inside the company, of late the mentality has been the two shows are equal. SmackDown most weeks draws a slightly larger audience due to UPN, 89 million homes, having more US penetration than TNN, 81.2 million homes. And even though it doesn't look that way because of the difference in network numbers versus cable numbers, SmackDown most weeks realistically draws a larger percentage of its potential homes as an audience than Raw, realistic rating figure we list. Both shows will be facing formidable competition come the fall season, as the CBS comedies on Monday are some of the hottest shows on television, and Monday Night Football traditionally takes a sizable chunk out of the wrestling audience. Thursday will be even tougher, with the new series of Survivor, plus Temptation Island both aiming at the same demographics as SmackDown, plus NBC's traditional strong lineup anchored by Friends. As mentioned last week, part of the change would include SmackDown being live every week, although that change wouldn't be immediate. The WCW Raw change could take place as soon as a few weeks after the Invasion pay-per-view, which at press time will be headlined by a 5 versus 5 tag team match. News drew a lot of complaints from people who were under the impression that Monday tickets for shows in August and September would, instead of being tickets to see Rock and Steve Austin, be tickets to see people like Booker T and DDP as the top headliners. The plan is for a lot of talent jumping, with the idea of many jumps, winding up with two rosters of as equal star power as possible. Probably close to half of the WCW roster would be current WWF talent, from top guys all the way to bottom guys. The idea is not to revive the spirit of WCW as much as to create two equal WWFs. The theory is, and this is just me breaking things down in a manner that may or may not be close to how they happen, that one side gets Austin, the other gets Rock, one gets Triple H and the other gets Angle, one gets Undertaker, the other gets Kane, one gets Edge and Christian, the other gets the Hardys and Lita. One gets Big Show, the other gets Billy Gunn, one gets Page, the other gets Booker T. With ratings declining, this hardly fell under the category of playing it safe. At risk are both the falling ratings of both Raw and SmackDown, with shows that, theoretically, would each feature less talent depth than they currently do. As stated many times here, interpromotional angles, worked or otherwise, usually are a big draw. Raw on June 25th from Madison Square Garden rebounded with its strongest rating since April 30th, a 4.65, and the show closing angle where Booker T laid out Vince McMahon did a 5.63 overrun, the highest rated segment on a Raw show since April 16th. But there are so many theories of what this means in turbulent times for the industry, that nobody really knows. If the feud heats up the entire scene, this will work to everyone's benefit because the current system, as is without a change, was going to continually decline. If not, the decline in ratings for both shows will quicken. The ultimate goal is to make the WCW brand an independent touring entity, running 4 shows per week, running a Saturday through Monday schedule, probably in mid-sized arenas as well as, eventually, monthly pay-per-view events. WWF would run a Thursday through Sunday road schedule, starting off with the live TV taping that would build for the weekend house shows and the monthly pay-per-view event. It is uncertain the timetable of all this, but there are tentative plans to get this underway by the fall. A lot depends on response to the early WCW Raw tapings and how quickly tickets sell, to gauge whether sufficient demand is there to run a full-time touring schedule. It is believed some WCW talent would work on WWF house shows until WCW has its own schedule. At some point in the fall, the current plan seems to be to separate the two companies completely and not come back for interpromotional matches until the demand is great. The belief was the current program was necessary to expose the WCW brand and talent on WWF television before changing the brand name on the Raw time slot rather than the original plan of keeping the two sides separate until WCW was built back up enough to be considered a viable challenger. The potential upsides are if this expansion works, it creates more revenue for the company. If the shows don't draw or WCW can't be licensed and merchandised as a new entity, it will create a lot more expense as cold arena acts touring can lose a lot of money in a hurry. Because the new wrestlers are coming in at far lower downsides, and without leverage of another strong organization, wrestlers whose contracts expire can also be negotiated downward if needed or cut. The talent expenses are not appreciably large in comparison to those that exist. It isn't like they are doubling salary costs for talent while doubling the number of events, and with the same administrators, those costs also aren't escalating, so it's far lower risk than most similar business expansions would be, taking the timing aspect out of it. The addition of WCW, because it is taking an existing time slot, will not increase TV ad revenue or compensation, one of the company's current leading revenue streams, and may, if ratings don't hold up for the two shows and the experiment fails, actually take it down. But without adding a taping, the only added production cost would be for the additional monthly pay-per-view, which unless this thing totally bombs, would more than take care of itself in revenue generated on the show. So house show, merchandise, licensing and pay-per-view revenue will be on one side and talent contracts, travel expenses and costs of promoting twice as many road events will be on the other side. The downside is the workload on the major office players will increase. Working for the WWF in a front office position is a high burnout job to begin with frequent turnover because of the hours required. While the wrestlers will work the same type of schedule, it's the same office people adding additional workloads with a larger crew of wrestlers, twice as many live events and pay-per-view shows to promote, and theoretically twice as many business deals to negotiate. While the writers won't have more television to write, they will have to write and keep angles straight for almost double the crew of performers. By necessity, they will have to create new superstars that are drawing cards because there would be twice as many events that would need star power to draw. The company hasn't been good at really pulling the trigger on that since the ascension in early 2000 of Triple H. For the production people, the travel will be much harder because they'll be working half the Sundays and then going to a live Monday, have a day off for travel, have to set for a Thursday in a different part of the country for another live shoot before going home and getting ready for the next week. The current Monday to Tuesday schedule, with one Sunday a month thrown in, with all shows during a week scheduled in close geographical proximity, is going to get more grueling. We've seen the mental errors, like happened with WCW when it did a similar Monday and Thursday live shoot, start to creep into WWF production. From the talent and the announcers and the writers, the signs of overwork and fatigue are everywhere. Too many wrestlers are physically breaking down. The upside for most is that their physical demands of TV main events are higher than house show matches, and while the number of dates worked may be the same, TVs will be cut back for the wrestlers. Even the most basic of angles, such as how to build pay-per-view events effectively, aren't being done well, and even the simple scenarios aren't being followed up well. This schedule will rectify what Vince McMahon considered perhaps the leading talent problem, the burning out of the talent by being the same people anchoring 4 hours of television per week. By seeing specific stars only once, theoretically it will make Raw and SmackDown into must-see events. At least in theory. The plan at press time is still to keep The Rock out of the current program, figuring it would be better for SummerSlam to be Rock's return, possibly for a rematch with Austin. Rock will be available in time for the Invasion show as Scorpion King finishes filming in a few weeks, so that decision can change. The strong upswing in ratings this week, if it stabilizes or increases next week, would make it almost a sure thing he wouldn't be back until after the Invasion show. Although Jerry Lawler has denied stories that he's going back, within the WWF he is being pegged as one of the WCW announcers. It either could be he's pegged in because they have a solution to the impasse with Vince McMahon involving Stacey Carter, and it's pretty clear he'd come back if that was resolved, but haven't closed the deal. Or they want his return, according to one source which is scheduled for as early as July 2nd in Tacoma, to be a surprise, and he's simply denying a done deal, similar to the DDP situation where they went with the Time Warner buyout hold-up story to protect the stalker angle when he was cast in the role from the start of the angle after the decision was made not to go with Austin. The other announcer would likely be either Michael Cole or Jim Ross. It's very clear the show will have the WCW name, but they want to make it totally as familiar looking as possible for WWF fans so as not to create a backlash. It's so perplexing because it seems so simple. WWF versus WCW is, at least at first, an easy natural rivalry. Started off as a shoot. It's built for 13 years and was a very nasty public fight during most of that period. Of course it would have been better if WCW was never off television and didn't lose its audience, but done correctly, it still had the chance to be the biggest program of all time. But King of the Ring from the Meadowlands in East Rutherford, New Jersey, the so-called kickoff featuring the first in-ring shot, DDP vs. Undertaker, ended up so disappointing from every standpoint. The show had a main event where the Office clearly gave up on 2 of the participants weeks before the match, after 2 weeks of which, if nothing else, temporarily turned things around from a morale standpoint and brought crowd heat and match quality way up. And the King of the Ring tournament, which in past years anchored the show, was reduced to largely an afterthought. So it was the first confrontation. Obviously nobody takes WCW seriously yet. Its fans are gone. Obviously Undertaker gets laid out bad in a heat spot the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time. Obviously the match, confrontation, looks different from a physical standpoint than anything we've seen. More serious. More tense. It shouldn't look like a shoot as in a UFC shoot, but it should look different stylistically than what other pro wrestling matches look like. No comedy and slapstick or even showy moves. Maybe like people's pre-UFC fantasies of what a shoot would look like would be the best description. Undertaker has to sell to make his opponent at first. Probably most of the way, because the opponent should do something mildly heinous at first. Big comeback, and when Page is about to take the medicine that hopefully the people finally want him to get, all the troops come out from WCW and give the WWF guy a bad beating, and it's on. Probably an angle involving WWF guys all in a room together watching tensely and cheering on their man, and the WCW guys barricading a door to that room shut to enable the horrid beatdown to make sense. The upside of confrontation instead of match is the indecisive DDQ when the WWF guys break down the door isn't a groan finish. Instead, it's a walkout with none of the differences needed, a groan finish to a letdown of a confrontation if ever there was one. And nearly a one-sided squash with DDP hardly getting in any offense. Far more important long-term to this business than anything else is the WCW project working. The first shot could have been a hot angle, or arguably, a slow tease of one. This was neither. At least with the NWA versus UWF feud, by the time they did the Nikita Koloff-Terry Taylor squash, first big title versus title confrontation, Starrcade 87, the feud was already over before it ever got off the ground, and doing the squash only buried the remnants. The reality is that WCW died a long time ago. But this feud should be carrying the illusion that isn't the case. And doing a squash to bury the remnants is the worst possible start at a time when studying history indicates when things like this happen, the business is going to go one way or the other, in a hurry. As for the match quality, it was above average, but somewhat sad in another way. With the exception of the Undertaker-Page confrontation, there was nothing on the show that wasn't solid and most of the matches were good. The last 2 matches were very long, and both were very good. The negative was the Meadowlands crowd had that dangerous attitude of sitting there telling the performers to show me something crazy. The only match that really delivered on that was Shane McMahon versus Kurt Angle, which was the show stealer. The negative is, that match was very dangerous in structure, and ended up being more dangerous when some of the stunts didn't work properly. By the time it was over, Angle had suffered a sprained tailbone, at first feared to be broken, a concussion, and needed 5 stitches above his right eye from a punch that landed, plus had a body filled with cuts and bruises largely from going through glass, as well as a potato shot by Edge as well. The last official word was it appeared Angle would only miss 2 house shows, The Last Dance in Louisville and Sunday in Spokane. The Saturday date scheduled for San Francisco was canceled several weeks ago due to poor ticket sales, and they are expecting him ready for TV next week. Unofficially as of press time, both Angle and Austin were expected to be very limited in what they can do physically for a few weeks. The only major injury note from the week turned out to be Chris Benoit. Benoit was diagnosed as having a blocked nerve in his C7 vertebrae, causing his right tricep to atrophy, particularly over the past week. At the show, the imbalance in arm size was beginning to get noticeable. Benoit decided last week to take time off to have surgery, because of fear the injury would worsen, and he'd have a permanent Paul Orndorff-like imbalance. The final decision wasn't made as he went to see specialists during the past week, taking more tests and visiting 3 more doctors before the final decision was made on June 22 when Dr. Lloyd Youngblood, The doctor who did the surgery on Austin's neck told him he needed the surgery immediately. Benoit worked the pay-per-view, and surprisingly, they didn't even do a television angle to explain his absence. On TV the next day they simply said in passing he was injured in the match and would be having neck surgery, and would be out 3 to 6 months. Benoit went back to San Antonio after the pay-per-view and would be having more tests done during the week. There is an argument that doing the traditional pro wrestling angle, which historically draws money and makes baby faces, the comeback from the big injury putting heat on the heel who taunts the face's name while he's gone for months, won't work in the current environment. So much when it comes to personnel changes, such as who will be in WCW or WWF, which theoretically would be separate by then, and who knows where the person doing the angle would be in 6 months and if it would be a viable program by then. How many times last year when a star was injured, Taz and Billy Gunn come to mind, but they weren't the only ones. Did they do the traditional pro wrestling TV angle to explain it, only to basically drop it upon their comeback? Of course, it looks like dropping the ball, since the company's approach when Triple H was the booking 101 handling of it. A program with Austin was immediately pushed for his return and his injury was played up huge on television with many comeback video features. The continued dropping even the most basic concepts is a real cause for concern. An Austin scare also took place as it was feared he suffered a broken hand when being thrown too far through the Spanish announcer's table by Booker T. His hand was badly swollen, so he also wasn't able to wrestle at the following TVs, and also came out of the show with his back and tailbone bothering him. He's expected to have his hand examined this week by a specialist and they are hopeful he'll be ready to wrestle by July 2nd. Chris Jericho also suffered a mild concussion, was woozy after the show and there was some concern about him driving, likely from a chair shot to the head by Benoit. He wrestled on Raw the next night. The main event, which was a very good long match, came off as a negative to the show to some people for several reasons. The main one was the lack of crowd heat as compared to usual main events, somewhat because they didn't do any stunts of the likes of which were done in the previous match. More so because both Benoit and Jericho's mega push ended on June 4th, some 3 weeks before the show, and due to their portrayal, very few fans took them seriously as contenders. The way the show built, the fans knew there would be no finish until Vince McMahon came, and by building it up that way and McMahon not being there, it had an empty feeling. Benoit, clearly, went into the ring worried. Over the past week, his tricep had noticeably atrophied and wasn't close to 100%. While nobody was saying so publicly, it was pretty evident watching that Austin's knees were in worse shape than in a while. Jericho missed a few spots as well. Like with the Hardys, this false push in the long run did more damage to Benoit and Jericho than no push at all. But if they hadn't gotten that initial push after Judgment Day, just imagine how lackluster the TV over the past month would have been. The end result of the match, with Austin retaining, was the only possible ending given Rock is coming back and theoretically the Austin vs. Rock title match should headline SummerSlam. A one-day or one-week Jericho reign wouldn't have helped him anyway. It made sense for Benoit to do the job, since he's the guy who isn't figured into the storylines for the next few months with his injury. But Benoit and Jericho were doomed from a heat standpoint the minute this thing was done as a three-way and portrayed in storyline that both were after him and there was no heat beforehand pitting the two against one another. It was a handicap match and all the odds were against Austin. That put the babyfaces, like in the famous No Limit Soldiers vs. West Texas Rednecks booking brilliance, in a death situation. They couldn't win for losing, made worse by the fact they were losing regularly on TV leading up to the main event. End result was a flat crowd for the main event, despite the guys being out there for nearly a half hour with a hard work rate from bell to bell and the match that attempted to tell a story. The Continental Airlines Arena was sold out a few hours after tickets were put on sale, with 17,777 in the building, which was 16,024 paying $1,132,395, one of the few non-WM gates ever in the United States to top 7 figures. Merchandise sales were an additional $131,673. Matt Hardy retained the European title pinning just incredible Peter Polacco in 7:03. They were doing a ref bump in the Sunday Night Heat match. Credible used his super kick for a near fall. Finish saw Lita use the Hurricane Rana off the top on Credible, stunning him long enough for Matt to do the twist of fate for the pin. 2 1/4 stars. Show started with DDP coming out mainly to cheers. He claimed he had hot personal footage of Sarah for his private collection that he couldn't show on TV. People aren't buying this aspect of the angle because there was little crowd response once he started talking storyline. Had a ticket for the front row and said he'd stay there until Undertaker showed up. As the show went on, they, on the screen,
aired footage of Page eating at a restaurant, getting out of his car, etc. The idea was that because DDP didn't get the big heel reaction they expected, they were going to present the idea that DDP would complain about what's being done to him, which is what he was doing, thereby making him a crybaby. It came out Sarah was now stalking him. And as it turned out, people still weren't buying it. 1. Kurt Angle pinned Christian J. Resso in the core semifinal match in 8-17. They were pushing Angle's quest to win back-to-back cores with the idea that nobody had ever won back-to-backs. Not true. Bret Hart did, although his first was before core was a pay-per-view, and that not even stars like Bret Hart, Triple H or Steve Austin were able to repeat. Problem is, Bret did. If you don't consider pre-pay-per-view events as actual cores, then it still doesn't make sense since Bret wasn't even in the 1994 tourney to not repeat and Austin wasn't in the 1997 tourney to repeat. Triple H was in the 1998 tourney and lost to Rock in a quest to repeat. So much for useless history. Angle got good heat. He suplexed Christian all over the place. Shane McMahon came out. Nice sequence where Angle missed a moonsault and Christian got a near fall. Angle went for the slam, but Christian countered going for the unprettier, but Angle countered with an ankle lock and Christian made the ropes. Christian countered the slam and hit the unprettier, but Shane broke up the pin, helping Angle. Angle then got the pin with the Angle slam. The storyline was that Shane was helping Angle to advance to tire him out before his match. 3 stars. 2. Edge, Adam Copeland pinned Rhino, Terry Garrin, in 8:52 in the other semi. Rhino undid the padding on a turnbuckle and Edge went sternum first into the exposed metal, selling it to make him the face, theoretically. Rhino used his big legs to do a Joe Stecker body scissors, a move nobody has seen since Kevin Von Erich. Crowd didn't really seem to know how to react. Good spot where both guys went for the spear at the same time and collided. Finish saw Rhino miss the gore and Edge put him away with the implant DDT. Being that Rhino lost to Show and Edge, now tell me what the purpose was for him to twice beat Jericho before Jericho's pay-per-view main event? 2.5 stars. 3. Bubba Ray, Mark LaMonica, and Devon, Devin Hughes. Dudley kept the tag titles over Spike Dudley, Matt Hyson, and Kane. Glenn Jacobs in 8:32. This was set up on heat, with Spike saying he was going to have a mystery partner. Spike took a lot of good bumps early. Big screw up when Kane used a power slam on Bubba and apparently Devon was supposed to break up the pin, but he didn't. Ref counted 2, Bubba didn't kick out, and everyone booed when the ref just stopped counting. Kane threw Spike over the top and he did a crossbody on both his brothers. Some near falls and saves. Dudley's did the was up spot without saying was up since they are now heels. They really should just drop the spot. Finish was Bubba scoring the pin on Spike after a 3D. After the match, Kane powerbombed Devon and then choke-slammed Bubba through the table. Jim Ross had a real bad match here as well. 2.25 stars. I think Page was growing older each segment they went to him. 4. Edge pinned Angle in 10:21 to win the tournament. Tournament had 0 impact. Build-up was lousy. Finals were put in the middle of the show like they were just Angle's prelim test for his real match. No real emphasis put on Edge winning the rest of the show. Angle took a dangerous flapjack early, nearly landing on his head. Angle suplexed Edge all over the place, including one over the top rope. Angle got a busted lip. Edge catapulted Angle into the barricades for a near fall. Ref bump and Angle got the ankle lock. Edge tapped, but no ref to see it. Shane came back out and speared Angle, leading to Edge scoring the pin after the Impaler DDT. 3 stars. 5. Jeff Hardy pinned X-Pac, Sean Waltman, in 7-11, to keep the light heavyweight title. Man, you know things are getting sad when the WWF was bragging about the fantastic rating of Tough Enough. Do you realize that rating they were bragging about was the same number as the all-time record low for Nitro? Good wrestling early. They did a totally blown spot which lost the crowd. X-Pac used the X-Factor, but Hardy got his feet on the ropes. He went for it a second time but Hardy countered and scored the pin after a swanton. 2.25 stars. The non-match with Undertaker vs. Page was next. People popped for the first punch and it was pretty much it. Page's Terry Funk comedy bumps in a serious heat program just seemed out of place. As far as the first physical confrontation between WWF and WCW, which this was, it couldn't have been planned out any worse. Page got very little offense in, and just bumped. Page's offense was just brief spots after low blows or chairs. They ended up brawling over the U.S. announcer's table. In the ring, Taker hit Page with a high kick and Page ran off in 540.
Shouldn't the first confrontation end with all the WCW guys swarming Undertaker and beating his ass, building heat, rather than a finish which made someone who needs to be a star right now with a lack of star power and multitude of non-stars under contract look bad, which is exactly the opposite of what needed to be done. At this point, oh sure, it was WCW that had bought WWF and hired their writing staff. 1/2 stars. 6. Angle pinned Shane McMahon in 26:00 of their street fight. Angle suplexed Shane all over the place and did some tremendously smooth mat work. Shane potatoed Angle with his first punch, busting him above the right eye. Very stiff, excellent, but far too dangerous match, particularly when WWF can ill afford another top guy going down, and then put Angle in a position where the risks were too high. McMahon came off the guardrail over the announcer's table with a clothesline, and didn't get much elevation, and came inches from beheading Paul E. In the process, Shane used a kendo stick and kind of brutalized Angle with it and used the ankle lock. Angle broke it. Shane used a float over DDT and was just sloppy enough that you knew it, but thankfully not sloppy enough that Angle was in another dangerous spot. Shane used the sharpshooter for a rope break. He put it on again, but Angle, in the hold, grabbed the stick to break the hold. Shane killed Angle with a garbage can lid, then went up for a shooting star press, but ended up landing on a garbage can. They brawled backstage. Angle tripped over a cable cord and landed, holding his back. The injury apparently took place when Angle did a suplex spot while they were brawling in that area. The big sequence started when he went to belly Shane through a thick glass stage setup. The glass didn't break, and Shane went down, almost head first, on the ground. That was dangerous enough, so they did it again, and both, as planned, went through the glass. The idea is they would do it again to come back the other side. Angle twice suplexed Shane and twice the glass didn't break. Finally he whipped him through. This was total insanity, and not in a good way. You had broken glass everywhere. The crowd was going crazy. And you had Angle, who was being counted on so highly in plans, being put in a situation where he could have been seriously injured because you just can't predict how broken glass will break. As it was, he was just scraped up. His back was all bloody and there was broken glass all over the floor, and they were reduced to putting the best worker the company had for the summer, putting himself at far too much risk than necessary just to do combat zone wrestling spots, and in New Jersey no less. Angle wheeled a prone Shane back to the ring and put him in the ring to pin him, but Shane kicked out. McMahon came back with a low blow and 3 hard garbage can lid shots, then did the Angle slam on Angle for a near fall. Angle catapulted Shane into the corner. Shane was supposed to hit the post, the 1981 Sergeant Slaughter bump in the famous Pat Patterson match, but it looked bad. Angle got a board and was hit Shane with it. Finish saw him use the board as a platform, and used it to stand up while on the top rope and delivering the Angle slam. Shane got a huge ovation after the match from the crowd. 4 stars. 7. Steve Williams, retained the WWF title in a 3-way over Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, and Chris Benoit in 27:52. Typical very hard work. They did several spots where one person would be injured to make it one-on-one for several minutes, and then just as somebody was beaten, the third guy would revive to make a save. First few minutes established Austin as the babyface, and the 2 guys who were going to jump to WCW were double-teaming him and trying to steal his belt. Then they turned on each other. Jericho got Austin in the walls, but Benoit saved. Benoit then suplexed Jericho over the top to the floor. Earl Hebner got bumped and Benoit hit Austin with a stunner, but no ref. Benoit hit Austin with the title belt, but Jericho recovered for the save. Jericho posted Benoit. This left Austin versus Jericho, and they struggled for Boston Crabs. Paul Heyman brought up Montreal. Good thing everyone's gotten over it by now. Then Heyman said those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. I'm not sure what this had to do with this match. Well, actually I am. History shows that companies that don't elevate new talent and keep the old talent in the same positions for long periods of time usually wind up like dinosaurs. You know, extinct. Benoit sold being injured, leading to Austin versus Jericho. Benoit ended up recovering and went to hit Austin with a chair, but he ducked and Jericho got hit. Isn't that screw-up spot a heel spot? Austin gave Benoit a stunner to injure him again. Austin gave Jericho 2 superplexes off the top rope. Benoit recovered and then gave Austin 5 German suplexes before Austin delivered a low blow. Junior kept mixing up Benoit with Jericho. Jericho put the walls on Austin in the middle of the ring. Instead of Benoit saving, as he'd done the entire match, he put the crossface on, and Austin tapped. Being that a precedent had been set when Undertaker and Kane both beat Austin in a similar 3-way on pay-per-view a few years ago, This was stunning. But not so fast.
Even though that was an acceptable finish on pay-per-view a few years ago, and on TV as recently as Monday, it was an illegal double team, so Hebner ordered the match to continue.
Booker T showed up out of the crowd and threw Austin through a table. Booker got excited and threw him too far, and Austin tried to protect himself since part of his body overshot the table, and in doing so injured his hand.
Jericho got the walls on Benoit, but a rope break. Jericho slipped on the ropes and screwed up a lionsault spot on Benoit. Jericho and Benoit then screwed up a second spot due to miscommunication. Jericho attacked Austin with wood and Austin sold like he was knocked out. Jericho gave Austin a moonsault but Benoit saved.
Benoit did the diving headbutt on Austin but Jericho pulled Hebner out.
Benoit then gave Jericho a backward superplex.
All three guys laid on the mat out and Austin, in dramatic face fashion, with all the odds against him, two wrestlers, all of WCW, and even Vince McMahon deserting him, draped his arm over Benoit for the pin. With Benoit being injured and out of action all summer, the only logical finish was for he to be the one pinned. There was no point in Jericho winning either, with Rock coming back to challenge Austin theoretically. A lot of people were mad because the same guys who never win the big ones didn't again after a false start of a push, but the problem wasn't the match. It was the decision to do a three-way and everything that was done on television after that decision was made.
3 3/4 stars.
The World Wrestling Federation has made major changes in its developmental program, which will end up with almost all its training talent based out of Cincinnati and Louisville. The moves of the past week included dropping all affiliation with Memphis Championship Wrestling and promoter Terry Golden, opening up an official relationship with Leigh Malady, Leigh Thatcher, and his Heartland Wrestling Alliance, dropping the contracts of several wrestlers and restructuring the relationships with Ultimate Pro Wrestling in Southern California, and pulling all or most of the talent from the EWA in Puerto Rico. The Talent Development Department, headed by Jim Ross, has become a full-time administrative job for assistants Dennis Brent, Bill Moody, Paul Bearer, and Bob Clark. The general feeling had been that the Ohio Valley program headed by Jim Cornette and Dan Briley, Dane Davis, had been a success, but Memphis had been a mess, with a revolving door of trainers and affiliations. The WWF officially announced cutting of 8 contracts: American Dragon, Rodney Lionheart, Rodrageous, Spanky, Shooter Schultz, Jason Spence, Christian York, Adam Birch, Joey Matthews, and Jason Arndt, Joey Abs, all of whom had been based in Memphis along with Pete Gass of the EWA. In addition, they will be dropping Sylvester Turkey, who had wrestled as the Collector and of late, Sly Scraper, Mike Howell, Mike Hard, formerly one of the Dupes, and Brian Keck from OVW. These decisions were largely considered for some time but not finalized until this week, which explains why WWF put forth no publicity of Keck's amazing achievement of literally walking right out of WWF Pro Wrestling Camp and placing in both freestyle and Greco-Roman in the U.S. Nationals a few months ago in Las Vegas. At least 2 others, Russ McCulloch and Charles Warrington, Chaz, who is not developmental talent but a WWF contracted wrestler who was assigned to EWA since they had nothing for him on the main roster, are on the bubble, with a final decision to be made on McCulloch at the end of the summer. The rest of the Memphis talent, Matthew Anoya, Sika's son and Eddie Fatu, Rikishi's younger brother, who worked as the Island Boys, Lisa Marie Varone Victoria, will be sent to OVW to train under Terry Pak, Tori, and work a program together to likely get ready for it in WWF. Scott Vick will also remain on the roster, although the feeling is he's ready and they are just waiting for the creative side to come up with a character and a way to introduce him. The WWF is also attempting to open up relationships with a Japanese office, something the company had no interest in doing until the acquisition of Johnny Ace, due to his connections with All Japan and Motoko Baba. Some of the cut talent is expected to be booked on All Japan tours, and there is also possible interest in opening up relations with New Japan. In the case of some of the cut talent, they were wrestlers who had been affiliated with the company for as long as 2 years or more. The feeling was in some cases that had either plateaued as far as improvement, and in other cases, it was simply felt that there simply wasn't going to be a spot on the roster for them. Jim Ross also hinted in the Ross report that part of the problem may have been the developmental structure, where the talent had stagnated because they weren't working with enough talent better than they were regularly, which stagnated their improvement. The WWF has no plans to start a new territory filled with experienced workers to help take them to that next level. The All Japan connection could be for some of the cut wrestlers, perhaps as well as the OVW wrestlers, as a second step to learning new things, a way for them to work with higher quality workers than they would have a chance to work with in the United States, as well as at the same time freshen up the stale All Japan stable of foreigners. I haven't seen enough of the Memphis crew of late, other than I had been impressed with Dragon and Spanky, dating to their start in San Antonio under Shawn Michaels. Dragon always got great reviews from everyone who had worked with him and most who had seen him. However, at 5'7" and 160 pounds, the feeling must have been he didn't have the size, and considering Spanky, York and Matthews were all on the small side. No matter what is said, the WWF will likely never develop a serious light heavyweight division as something separate, and without it and with all the monsters, it's hard for people that size except for a rare gimmick person, a role Spike Dudley now has, to be the little guy fighting giants. This means there aren't a lot of roster openings, especially because of the plethora of big men that it takes either a mega push with someone in the office really going to bat for your storyline, Spike Dudley or X-Pac, or incredible talent with a good physique and charisma, Eddie Guerrero, for a smaller guy to make it. With the exception of Bradley, who is very talented and bigger than they are, but now hampered because he resembles Rob Van Dam, who they are in the process of debuting. The wrestlers kept from the Memphis crew all had good size. Most of these changes are expected to take place toward the end of July. Golden is being given a few weeks to write the WWF talent out of his storylines before they are let go or sent to Cincinnati, and the cut talent will be working out a grace period while still under contract. It is also expected that the other WWF talent in Puerto Rico, Oxy Connor, Elo Brown, and Tiger Ali Singh will be recalled to the main promotion at some point in the near future. The business relationship between WWF and UPW is also being modified as UPW owner Rick Baseman is being taken off the WWF payroll. Baseman had a deal where WWF would send him talent for his monthly big shows at the Galaxy Theater and he was on salary. As an employee, the WWF would have right of first refusal on all talent he either discovered or came through his training system. In addition, he would get an agent's fee for every UPW talent signed by WWF. He will still get that agent's fee if the WWF signs talent, making his affiliation with them totally incentive-based. Baseman's students were noted for having a great look, but for various reasons, most of them didn't end up making it. The jury is still out on John Cena, now in OVW but generally considered one of the top prospects, Nathan Jones, who has huge size and natural charisma, Varone, and John Heinrich, who has huge size but doesn't have the immediate charisma, all of whom will be working in OVW by the end of the month. The only other UPW wrestler under a WWF developmental deal is the injured Aaron Aguilera. Baseman has gotten WWF a lot of women talent with a great look like Frosty Moore, Mandy Karen Mar, Muffy, and the twins, but none stuck. The WWF has gotten away from introducing lots of new women who can't wrestle in the ring, hence all the training Varone is doing, since they already have Tori Wilson, Sarah Calloway, and Stacy Keibler to introduce and market over the next few months. With Louisville and Cincinnati being in close geographical proximity, plus the fact that Cornette, Davis and Thatcher all get along and all have similar business philosophies as Ross, the feeling is things would be better managed. In addition, the wrestlers in both groups would frequently work with each other since Thatcher regularly uses OVW talent on his major shows. In fact, the current plan is for HWA to start doing television and attempt to syndicate it into Cincinnati and Dayton as regular house show stops. The show would be taped out of Davis's gym on Sunday nights in Jeffersonville, Indiana, the same gym that OVW tapes every Wednesday. WWF also is expecting to send either unbooked talent or those with experience in teaching, like Al Snow and Dean Malenko, at times to work in those cities, and because they are close together, would be able to help at both gyms while on a several-day swing, and Bobby Eaton would work with both groups. But ultimately, these moves signal several things. First off, there had been problems in Memphis for some time, and the decision was made to simply pull out of all affiliations and avoid the political infighting the city. Due to the on-again, off-again relations with Jerry Lawler and his on-again, off-again relations with both Golden and Randy Hales, there had been numerous back-and-forth switches when it came to Memphis. The WWF developmental talent deal, starting with them working for Hales, and at the end, the OVW talent would work the territory on weekends, being switched to Golden, leading to the OVW talent no longer being part of Memphis, at the request of Lawler to Vince McMahon after a falling out with Lawler and Hales. Then both Golden and Hales companies became developmental areas sharing the talent, since Golden promoted more house shows and Hales had the live TV slot after Lawler and Hales made up. Then Hales' promotion was dropped because he wanted to continue working with Lawler after WWF and Lawler had their problems, ending with Lawler and Golden on opposite sides. Golden had problems with both trainers WWF sent his way, Tracy Smothers and Eaton, resulting in both being dismissed. Eaton ended up keeping his job at Cornette's request and is now teaching in Louisville. While the decisions were likely made some weeks back, it wasn't announced until after Golden had finished a weekend of shows with WWF talent. There ended up being a lot of heat because he allegedly told Bradshaw and Farouk to give the Haas brothers a beating in a match last weekend where they switched the MCW tag titles to break them of a supposed cocky attitude, a type of old-school training scenario that the WWF didn't want to be part of their system, since they consider the brothers strong prospects. More importantly, the entire philosophy of the business has changed with the lack of competition. WWF established developmental contracts and developmental territories largely to stockpile at a relatively low cost those with the right look or aptitude that came along before WCW could sign them. Over the past few years, both companies were aggressive when it came to getting contracts on people that were felt to have potential, and someone seen as a hot prospect due to their look, like Brock Lesnar, had offers from WWF, WCW as well as New Japan while still wrestling in college. Since the purchase of the WCW name and elimination of competition, WWF has not felt the need to be as aggressive in signing impressive indie talent, and York and Matthews were the only new talent signed this year, and that was done when WCW was still in business and had an interest in them. On the flip side, with WCW not in business as competition, the developmental program and the ability to create new drawing cards out of it is actually far more important long-term to business than ever before. The 4-year relationship between the WWF and Johnny Laurer and the transformation of the character Chyna ended abruptly on June 21 when Laurer was sent a letter that the company was dropping all further contract negotiations with her. Laurer, 31, will remain under contract with the company until her present deal expires on November 30, but is not expected to be used on television any longer. At press time, there were no storyline plans made about what to do regarding the women's championship that she held at the time. Plans were made to no longer use her. Her character and her non-ring persona underwent many transformations in her WWF run, which peaked from a marketing standpoint over the past year as a Playboy issue with her on the cover sold more than 1 million copies, making it the best-selling issue of the magazine in decades, and her much-criticized autobiography climbed as high as number 2 on the bestsellers list before fading rather quickly. There are several aspects to the break-off in negotiations, resulting from an impasse, but much of it was inevitability. Laurer wanted to pursue acting and didn't want to work house shows. She still wanted to work against and beat men, something the company no longer wanted to promote. She didn't want to work with the women or sell for them, so ultimately, there was little that could be done. The entire personal situation, involving being the jilted member in a triangle of major players, didn't help her cause as part of a locker room in a business that is paranoid to begin with. After her much-publicized break-off with agent Barry Bloom, which resulted in a lawsuit, as well as the breakup of her personal relationship with Paul Levesque, HHH, she found herself in the uncomfortable position of being the ex-girlfriend in the same job where the new girlfriend was not only the owner's daughter but the head scriptwriter, while the ex-boyfriend was the most influential wrestler in the company when it came to creative. Those in the company say Triple H never played politics in getting Chyna's character buried. There is a belief of that among many wrestlers, even though the prevailing belief seemed to be it was true, but she had it coming because she had gotten a big head from her success. When the changes were made about her not wrestling men, a decision most seemed to agree with anyway, there would be the natural paranoia, whether justified or not, from her side that politics and new enemies were involved. The company had difficulties with the demands from her new agent, who saw the fact Chyna had her successes in sales of the magazine and book as a way to demand Laurer could have a deal similarly structured to a top 5, Triple H, Rock, Austin and Undertaker level star. WWF did offer her a new contract and agreed to some of her requests, but money figures were far apart when negotiations ceased. But the writing may have been on the wall for some time. In recent months, on at least one occasion, when a male wrestler who had worked with her had complained about his plight in the program, he was told that they needed to feature her strongly on television to sell the magazine and the book, but the push would be short-term. Nevertheless, as recently as 2 months ago, the company was planning on doing a long-term program with her turning heel on Lita in a women's title program that never really got off the ground. She had expressed interest once again in not wrestling Lita, but instead doing some sort of an angle with Eddie Guerrero, a storyline that was briefly teased, and then dropped. Chyna, who had been marketed well as a hero to the WWF's female audience, which got behind the idea of a powerful woman kicking ass on men that had done her wrong, had gotten dropped the original planned idea earlier in the year where the 2 angles with the neck injury would be used to explain her not wrestling men, and be her Achilles heel, so to speak, to sell as a babyface when facing the smaller women in the company. It had always been tough because, most notably with Jericho, the male audience, which is the vast majority, didn't like the idea of a woman, even a large one, beating up and fighting evenly with male pro wrestlers. Chyna became very unpopular among insiders because people saw it as an undeserved push, because her work itself, had she been a male,
would never have gotten her past the mid-level indies, and she got plenty of heat when on several occasions she complained publicly about the WWF hiring Trish Stratus based on nothing but how she looked, with the irony that Lauer also had nothing but a unique look backed up by strong marketing and being in the right place at the right time to offer. Chyna was presented as one of the company's leading superstars, so when she wasn't having even matches against men, she always got a great reaction. The company was also training Lisa Marie Varon, who has more size than the current women in the WWF, to be a future opponent. But even then, everyone saw her role as short-term, and there was considered a better-than-even chance they would phase her out when her contract expired, long before the purchase of WCW removed her option of being a major celebrity who could jump to the opposition television show. After doing the angle, Chyna refused to sell the angle through the big match and the rest of her career, and just squashed all the women she worked against, including Ivory at WrestleMania, to win the title. The timing, while sounding strange on the surface since she has 5 months left on her deal, isn't. For the WWF, the timing is much better for her to disappear quietly from television, and in order to continue being paid, keep a low profile to avoid a breach of giving unsanctioned interviews complaining about her treatment. By the time December rolls around and she would have the ability to go public, should she even choose to, wrestling fans will already see her as yesterday's news because of the time frame, and mainstream media interest in her will have likely fallen greatly. With Lita being the new hot commodity, Lauer and Amy Dumas became friends and formed almost a pact backstage. As insiders say, Lauer totally outworked Dumas, leading to their Backlash match, which the company wanted to go completely different, not so much the finish as the story of the match itself. It wound up with the story that Chyna had Lita beat on a few occasions, but refused to pin her, then pinned her clean in the middle. This both resulted in the perception that Lita, nor any of the women, were in her league, but also took the edge off Lita. This slowed down a little as far as the rising star who was on fire. Then Lauer took time off for surgery, which killed the program. Lauer arrived in the WWF in early 1987 as a jacked-up, large, mannish-looking female bodybuilder. She was the last person one would think of as someone who would be considered a sex symbol or Playboy material. After teasing matches for more than a year where the male wrestlers would sell for her in spots, she was soon wrestling men, and went so far as to win the IC title on a couple of occasions and have even feuds with top-level male wrestlers including Jeff Jarrett and Jericho. Although there was much opposition to the Jericho feud, at the time she was Triple H's girlfriend, and he wielded major influence in the company. Before that, many will point to the ascension of Triple H from an underachieving wrestler getting a big push to a genuine star, to the addition of Chyna to his entourage creating a dynamic television pairing. However, after adding a wig, huge breast implants at the time thought to balance out a 200-pound frame, and much reconstructive surgery on her face, the new Chyna in fact became one of the most successful marketing creations of Vince McMahon and resulted in her getting a lot of acting work over the past 2 years. Ironically, her body, which was her calling card, changed once again this year as she went on the Hollywood actress diet, dropping a lot of weight and losing much of her trademark muscle mass, although she was still easily the most muscular woman getting any serious acting roles in Hollywood, which, due to her proportions changing, with the same implants, made her come across almost like a cartoon figure. Chris Adams, a fixture of the Texas wrestling independent scene from his fame during the glory days of world-class championship wrestling, was indicted on June 22 on charges of manslaughter in connection with the death of a 30-year-old woman who overdosed. Adams, 45, was indicted in the death of Linda Kaffengst of Dallas, who died on April 22, 2000 from a combination of alcohol and GHB, an illegal drug, known in some circles as the date rape drug that is very popular within pro wrestling and is believed to be responsible in some form to several near-death experiences among wrestlers. Adams, who was with Kaffengst, was found the next morning after also overdosing by a friend in the friend's apartment at 5:30 a.m. Kaffengst was unconscious on the living room floor and Adams was passed out in a chair. The friend called 911 and started performing CPR. Both were rushed to a hospital in Plano, Texas, where the woman was pronounced dead on arrival. Adams, who faces a maximum 20 years in prison and a $2,000 fine, was taken into custody by the entire Athens, Texas Police Department later that day when he showed up for a scheduled match for the Superstars of Wrestling promotion, where he was scheduled to headline the event. The show took place as scheduled with a reshuffled lineup. Adams has faced problems with alcohol abuse in the past, as he was arrested and spent 3 months in prison in 1986 after an incident involving alcohol and his violent behavior on an airplane. He also gained minor publicity in the 80s over being arrested in a violence incident involving then-wife Toni, at the time a pro wrestling valet, which made the local papers. That case was somewhat noteworthy because Adams was a top babyface in Dallas at the time,
and there was fear because of the publicity, and because Tony Adams was a known wrestling character by that point, that the fans would turn on him. But he appeared at the arena later that week and the reaction was the same for him as the week before. Adams, who has been wrestling for 23 years after starting in his native England where he grew up as something of a judo star, was a huge star in Texas during the glory days of world-class championship wrestling from 1984 through 1986, when he left the promotion after a talent raid of the company by former world-class booker Ken Lusk, Ken Mantell working for Bill Watts. His career peaked in 1985 when he was considered one of the top in-ring performers in the world. His biggest career match was when he teamed with the late Gino Hernandez as the dynamic duo in a double hair versus hair match at the Cotton Bowl against Kevin and Kerry Von Erich, which drew 26,000 fans in October of 1985, leading to both members of the dynamic duo being shaved bald in the ring. Adams turned backface a few months later, and a huge feud was set up with Hernandez, but Hernandez overdosed on cocaine and died before it got off the ground, leaving Adams having turned but with no opponent, and he never was able to regain that level of fame. He's probably more important historically as the original trainer and first major opponent of stunning Steve Austin, in one of those strange pro wrestling feuds where Austin teamed with Jeannie Clark, Adams' ex-wife, against Adams and then wife Tony, in a feud that caused a major attendance turnaround for a then faltering Dallas promotion in 1990. The end result of life imitating art was Austin's second marriage, with Clark, which broke up a few years ago. Adams was also involved in the feud that put female ballets on the map in late 1983 and 1984, teaming with Sunshine Valerie French against Jimmy Garvin, James Williams, and Precious Patty Williams, with their first match being one of the top 3 matches on the May 6, 1984 Texas Stadium show that drew 32,123 fans underneath the famous Kerry Von Erich NW, a title win over Ric Flair. During his peak, he held the American Heavyweight title, the top singles belt in the promotion, 4 times between late 1983 and the summer of 1985, largely during his feud with Garvin and Von Erichs. When World Class pulled out of the NWA in 1986, Adams was the company's second world heavyweight champion, beating Rick Rude on July 4, 1986. Adams never lost the title, as it was vacated when he went on trial for the airline incident. Adams' brother Neil is a judo legend, having won Olympic silver medals for Great Britain in 1980 and 1984. Chris Adams first came to North America in 1980 working for Stampede, and later worked in Mexico, Oregon and California before being in the right place at the right time when Texas took off with teenagers, and Adams, with boyish good looks and British accent, wound up like the Von Erichs, becoming a superstar babyface in the area among teenage girls. He later turned on the Von Erichs in late 1984 and had the biggest run of his career. Adams' career took a turn for the worst in 1987 after leaving World Class for Bill Watts' UWF, and then the company was sold to Jim Crockett Promotions, and Booker Dusty Rhodes did nothing with Adams as a member of the Stepchild crew, and he returned to a Dallas territory that never regained its past glory. He also worked in mainly a jobber role for WCW in recent years as part of a British group with Steve Regal and David Taylor, who didn't take kindly to him being linked with them. Adams was very unpopular among the crew. As the stars of that territory either died or retired, Adams remained the last link in the Texas indie scene to its glory. The first real good ratings news in wrestling since the loss of the WCW audience in April came on the June 25th Raw, doing the 4.65 rating, 4.16 first hour, 5.10 second hour, and a 7.6 share. The growth of numbers throughout the show, with only one quarter dropping, was a sign of a show that people either enjoyed or at least were intrigued by, as the strong second hour growth also indicated. The peak number was a 5.63 for the closing segment, where Austin and Angle went to WWF New York, looking for Shane and Booker, who were instead at MSG, and Booker laid out Vince. The second highest rated segment, at 5.17, was for the segment with Shane and Booker at WWF New York and coming back to Vince telling Austin to go there and kick his ass, and the APA pep talk. The highest rated match was Jericho vs. Tajiri at 5.05. The only decline throughout the show was Edge vs. Gunn, which lost 300,000 viewers. The big gains after the early normal upswing were 558,000 viewers for Undertaker and Kane vs. Dudley's and 741,000 viewers for the closing Angle. SmackDown on June 21st drew a 3.6 rating, 4.1 realistic rating, which was up from the record low of the previous week, to finish in 4th place among the 6 networks on a night of mainly reruns. Raw on June 18th drew a 4.20 rating, 3.79 first hour, 4.56 second hour, and a 7.0 share for approximately 5.5 million viewers. Peak rating was for the Spike and Benoit and Jericho vs. Austin and Dudley's match at 4.97, which is better than most of the main events have drawn over the last several weeks. The segment where DDP was revealed as the stalker drew a 4.63, second best of the show.
The rating grew throughout the show with only one exception, which was Show vs. Christian, losing about 344,000 viewers. The Page segment saw an increase by 603,000 viewers, and the main event was an increase of 610,000 viewers. The debut episode of Tough Enough on MTV on June 21 drew a 2.1 rating and 3.6 share, making it the top-rated show on cable for the night. The show got tremendous reviews. MTV was averaging a 1.1 in that time slot this season. For June 23 to 24, Livewire did in 0.74, Superstars did in 0.73, and Heat with the live show before the pay-per-view was up to a 1.24. The Heat record low on June 17 ended up with an 0.97 rating and 2 share. It was actually viewed in less homes than either Superstars or Livewire for the week. Lucha Libre on Galavision fell to normal levels on June 19, doing a 2.2 rating and 3.1 in the male 18 to 34 target demo. The June 17 special, Padresimo, airing the year-old tape of the triple_A/EMLL joint show from Plaza de Toros in Mexico City, drew a 1.1 rating.
Observer poll results. Traditional Observer pay-per-view poll results based on phone calls, fax messages and emails to the Observer as of Tuesday, June 26. WWF King of the Ring.
Thumbs up 179, 36.0%.
Thumbs down 214, 43.1%. In the middle 104, 20.9%. Best match poll, Shane McMahon vs. Kurt Angle, 322. Steve Austin vs. Chris Jericho vs. Chris Benoit, 61. Worst match poll, Undertaker vs. DDP, 231. Dudley's vs. Kane and Spike Dudley, 62. X-Pac vs. Jeff Hardy, 59. Steve Austin vs. Chris Jericho vs. Chris Benoit, 26. 1 year ago this week, Delaware Chancery Court Judge William Chandler ruled in favor of the WWF and Viacom in a lawsuit filed by the USA Network attempting to keep the WWF cable package. Chandler ruled that while USA had the contractual right of matching Viacom's deal to keep Raw and the rest of the shows, that by not offering a deal which included a guarantee of no preemptions of Raw, which Viacom offered for TNN, that USA hadn't matched every stipulation of meeting the proposed deal in their counteroffer, even though they met the monetary terms. USA had agreed to match the $28 million per year rights fees for a 5-year contract that would expire in September 2005 for cable exclusivity of the WWF wrestling product, which is the deal Viacom and WWF agreed to and is now in effect. USA had paid $5.2 million per year for the package under the existing contract, which expired in September. As it turned out, USA appealed the decision, which left everyone swearing as the Court of Appeals in Delaware took its time on the case and made a ruling just days before Raw was scheduled to debut on TNN, holding back much promotion by Viacom of the move, before finally ruling in Viacom's favor. WWF released its annual stockholders report, showing the company grossed $379.3 million during the 1999 to 2000 fiscal year and earned a pre-tax profit of $85.7 million. These were sizable increases over 1998-99 numbers of $251.5 million gross and $56.4 million in profits. Paul Heyman stated, in regards to the future of ECW, which was on TNN and was expected to be cancelled with the WWF deal, that a week from now, it'll be a champ or a chump. The week actually stretched out to being 6 months before the weight of his debts forced him to throw in the towel on making a company-saving television and partnership deal. A very disappointing King of the Ring tournament at the Fleet Center in Boston saw Kurt Angle score wins over Chris Jericho, Crash Holly and Rikishi to win the tournament. Main event saw Rock regain the WWF title from Triple H through the back door, in a 6-man tag match where the winner of the Fall If the Face Team won, would get the title. Rock teamed with Kane and Undertaker over Triple H and Vince and Shane McMahon in 1754 when Rock pinned Vince after a rock bottom in one of the weaker WWF pay-per-view main events of the past few years. The show, which did a 1.19 buy rate before 14,464 paying $865,778, only drew 20% thumbs up, 62% down and 18% in the middle, with Edge and Christian vs. Test and Albert vs. Too Cool vs. Hardy's voted as best match, and the now legendary Gerald Briscoe vs. Pat Patterson evening gown match voted as worst match. It also ran away in the year-end voting for worst match of the year, while the show placed fourth for worst major show of the year, losing only to WCW events. A crowd of 2,600 fans paid $32,000 for the 30th anniversary show of wrestling at the Louisville Gardens, the biggest crowd up to that point in history for Ohio Valley Wrestling. The crowd was there largely to see WWF stars Mick Foley and Kane, as well as old-time area favorites like the Fabulous Ones and Jackie Fargo. Kane and the Damage beat D'Lo Brown and Rob Conway, with Foley as ref in the main event. Hiroshi Hayes became the first pro wrestler ever to win a seat in the Japanese lower house. Hayes had previously won an election to the upper house. Hayes was a personal protege of then Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori, who recently resigned over the economic problems in Japan. He won largely due to his strength among the female voters. Raw did a 6.43 rating to Nitro's 2.84. Raw's Rock vs. Angle vs. Triple H main event did a 7.99. Nitro's main event was Jarrett vs. Goldberg vs. Nash vs. Scott Steiner, which did a 2.21. SmackDown did a 4.18, Thunder a 2.45, EAT a 2.69, ECW and 0.8, and Galavision 2.3. Minoru Tanaka and Koji Kanemoto won the IWGP Junior Tag titles from Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani, a match that placed fifth in Match of the Year balloting. Takaiwa and Otani are no longer part of New Japan due to an angle. Daijiro Matsui got pounded badly in a King of the Cage match against Todd Medina. 1 year later, he defeated highly regarded Pele in Pride. New Jack suffered a chipped ankle in 3 places doing a balcony dive in Milwaukee. Gorgeous George debuted for ECW and didn't last long. Vince Russo was sitting it out in WCW, thinking that the shows were having too much wrestling, which would cause the ratings to decline, and thus, the company would be forced to come back to him. The saddest part about it is that they did. Dr. Richard Fleer, the father of Ric Flair, passed away at the age of 81 after complications from bowel surgery. He had been in poor health and on dialysis for some time.
Hulk Hogan on Bubba the Love Sponge claimed that Fox was giving him a $150 million talent budget, and after the next pay-per-view, where they shot the angle which ended up being his last show for the company, he was leaving WCW, a statement done to set up the planned angle.
The New York Times ran a feature article on Brock Lesnar signing with the WWF. Chris Jericho was named the sexiest man in Manitoba in a Winnipeg Sun poll. Madison Square Garden drew its 11th straight sellout. Streak is now up to 18 and grossing a non-pay-per-view record of $511,857 on $16,975 paid, with Rock and Dudley's vs. Triple H and X-Pac and Road Dogg as the main event. 5 years ago this week, Titan Sports filed a lawsuit and a request for a restraining order against Turner Broadcasting, WCW, and Eric Bischoff as a result of the angle where Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were portrayed as outsiders invading WCW. The lawsuit ended up being settled out of court 4 years later. Vince McMahon said he regretted filing the suit but said, "I have finally been pushed up against a wall with no other options to protect my company. My wife and I have committed our adult lives to building the World Wrestling Federation. This company competes very well and I dare say, stays ahead in a marketplace where quality of programming, creativity, star development and consumer interest reflects success. However, when a giant competitor uses your very creations to dupe and confuse the public, then the playing field isn't level, and you are forced to fight in a different arena." WCW had just started a Monday night win streak over the WWF, which lasted nearly 2 more years. King of the Ring at the Mecca in Milwaukee drew 84% thumbs up, 7% down, and 9% in the middle. The show is most memorable for Steve Austin uttering the Austin 3:16 phrase for the first time after beating Jake Roberts in the finals. The Stone Cold era, which turned out to be the most profitable era for any wrestling company in history, is usually traced to beginning on this show. Main event saw Shawn Michaels keep the WWF title, pinning Davey Boy Smith in 26-25 of a 4 1/4 stars match. The show drew a sellout 8,762, paying $142,568 and an 0.6 buy rate. One of the most eventful shows in the history of ECW took place at the ECW Arena in Philadelphia. In a match that started at 12:30 a.m. and had a broken top rope 2 minutes in, Sabu vs. Rob Van Dam at the ECW Arena ended with both men doing stretcher jobs before 1,500 fans. In a supposed shoot fight, Taz added to his reputation, beating UFC giant, 6'8", 340-pound Paul Verhoeven with a choke after Perry Saturn interfered. Missy Hyatt later revealed she gave Verhoeven sexual favors in order to get him to finally agree to put Taz over. Verhoeven never did another American pro wrestling match afterwards, calling ECW a conch shell game.
They also started the controversial angle where Sandman's wife, then known as Peaches, became Raven's valet, but also Sandman's son Tyler Fullington, 9 years old, was put in the angle dressed up like Raven and disowning his father. That one cost them some TV stations. As there were technical problems and it was midnight, Christina Lom, known as Kimona Wanalaya, did a strip-tease routine to keep the crowd in the building for the main event. After suffering a knee injury 1 week before the match, Ken Shamrock canceled a Pancrase main event against Masakatsu Funaki and subbed Lion's Den stablemate Vernon White, an almost identical situation with Pride 5 years later, which resulted in Igor Vovchankin's stunning loss to Trey Telligman. In what was billed as the Aswaz final event ever at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, a disappointing crowd of 1,000 came to see Jerry Lawler vs. Cyberpunk Fire, Wolfie D. On the undercard, Bart Sawyer teamed with rookie Flex Cabana, Dwayne Johnson aka Rock, to win the tag team titles over Brickhouse Brown and Reggie B. Fine in the tournament final. Nitro did a 3.2 rating to 2.7 for Raw. WCW Saturday Night did a 2.2, WCW Main Event did a 2.0, WWF Action Zone did 1.6 and WWF Mania drew 1.2. Nitro was in Charlotte before 4,238 fans with a terrible show headlined by a three-way where Harlem Heat won the tag titles over Sting and Lex Luger in the Steiners when Kevin Nash and Scott Hall came out with baseball bats and cleaned house, but Booker pinned Luger. The crowd all night continually chanted, "We want Flair." Flair was backstage at the show, but the decision was made not to put him on television. Think about it. Raw drew a sellout 4,660 in Green Bay. Undertaker beat Austin via DQ in a long, boring match when Goldust threw dust in Undertaker's eyes in the main event. A prelim match saw Ahmed Johnson pin Hunter Hearst Helmsley with a Pearl River plunge quickly. 10 years ago this week, the trial of Dr. George T. Zarian, which was the beginning of the downfall of the World Wrestling Federation, began in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Zarian, the well-known drug doctor who routinely sold steroids and painkillers in the company's locker room while working for, of all people, the government itself, Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission, during most of the 80s, was on trial for selling steroids and painkillers to 5 wrestlers, in specific Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan, Dan Spivey, Roderick Toombs, Roddy Piper, Richard Vigneault, Rick Martel, and Brian Blair. Hogan's attorney, Jerry McDevitt, was able to get Hogan excused from testifying in the case for personal reasons that never became public. McDevitt ended up after the trial, becoming Vince McMahon's lead attorney and was on the opposite side of Hogan 3 years later in the even more famous McMahon steroid trial. All the others testified receiving steroids from Zarian either in Federal Express packages or purchasing it from him directly when he set up shop at WWF house shows. Spivey admitted purchasing Decadurabolin, testosterone, Valium, and Halcyons. Spivey said he felt he needed steroids to keep his job as a wrestler, but was only taking minimal doses of the 2 drugs as well as a Navar at the time. Lawyers for Piper tried feverishly to get him out of testifying on the same grounds as Hogan, but failed. Piper admitted purchasing Decadurabolin, a Navar, Winstrol 5 and Stanozol, the drug made famous in the Ben Johnson case, as well as Halcyon and vitamins. When asked if Zarian ever pushed drugs on him, he said yes. Blair admitted purchasing a Navar, Decadurabolin and testosterone from Zarian. Blair said he was afraid to get steroids on the black market because he didn't think they were safe. Martel admitted purchasing Decadurabolin, testosterone and a Navar, but that Zarian never pushed any drugs on him. Zarian ended up being convicted at the test case of the government's new law which prohibited physicians from prescribing and dispensing steroids without a just medical cause. Needing them to draw money and keep their jobs didn't apparently fall under that description, and serving several years in prison. The WWF was in a panic as this trial was set to begin. Basil DeVito, the VP of Marketing and later to become famous as the president of the XFL, sent out a statement noting that we stand by our philosophy of wholesome family entertainment and the positive example we set for the youth of America. To ensure the safety and well-being of our performers, fans and employees, in June 1987, after Jim Duggan and Iron Sheik were caught together in the middle of their feud on the Jersey Turnpike with some burned marijuana in the car and both were then fired, the WWF adopted a drug policy prohibiting the use of controlled substances in connection with any of its professional activities. The statement ended up being almost a laughingstock that the company later apologized for,
because the issue in question was steroids, and the WWF had never tested any of its wrestlers for steroids, and the only drug ever tested for was cocaine.
With all the bad publicity, the WWF pulled Hogan from all his weekend house shows.
The WWF claimed it was due to a neck injury Hogan had suffered. "It's a miracle this hasn't come out before now," said Jerry Lawler, then a rival promoter, noting steroids are obviously a requirement for those guys. DeVito responded to that charge saying, "I feel it not productive to respond to any comments made by competition."
Former WWF stars Billy Graham and Bruno Sammartino estimated 95% of the wrestlers in the WWF were on steroids. They were then called liars by several in the WWF years later under oath. Jim Hellwig estimated the percentage at 90% or more, and Hogan at 80% or more.
Wahoo McDaniel in a Miami Herald article backed up the 95% estimate, saying the majority of wrestlers in WCW, where he had recently worked as a road agent, were on them as well.
Jim Herd, president of WWF, responded by saying that we don't test for steroids, but we would if we promoted amateur athletes.
EMLL, in the midst of the hottest period in the history of the company, drew a sellout of 17,000 fans for a terrible show with a main event of Conan and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Sangre Chicana over Cien Caras and Pero Arguello, a heel at the time, and Mascara Anno 2000 via DQ when Caras low-blowed Conan in a bad match, and El Satanico beat Kato Kung Lee in a hair versus hair match which was a total dud. Greg Rollins, billed at 7'5", probably a legit 7'1", a protege of Bill Eadie, debuted in New Japan for his first, and what turned out to be his only tour, which I guess tells you what you need to know. In a weird business, one of the weirdest stories ever was taking place as former Pro Wrestling This Week host Joe Pedicino bought the Aswa from Jerry Jarrett to form his Global Wrestling Federation on ESPN. Well, that's what it looked like at the time. Pedicino, claiming he had $25 million in backing from a wealthy Nigerian businessman, closed a deal to buy the Jarrett territory and the ESPN contract that went with it. But Jarrett's money never arrived. He ended up getting faxed pieces of paper claiming CDs worth money. It took several weeks of people claiming many different things, but ultimately, Jarrett was never paid and the Aswa continued to exist as it was.
Pedicino later, with far less money, did form the GWF, which ran out of Dallas until it ran out of money.
Jesse Ventura signed to be the radio color commentator for the Minnesota Vikings.
Ric Flair was embroiled in a heated contract dispute with Jim Herd, which ended up with Flair being fired by Herd after no showing a match where he was scheduled to lose the NWA title to Barry Windham, and then showing up on WWF TV several months later with the old NWA belt, which he ended up having to give back after WWF lost the court fight with WCW NWA for his first feud with Hulk Hogan. WCW fired Spivey just before his testimony in the Zarian case where it came out he was using steroids, but he made it easier by refusing to do a job for PN News.
Scott Steiner, who held the tag titles with Brother Rick, underwent surgery under Dr. James Andrews for a major bicep tear. Somehow after such an injury, his biceps ended up growing much larger years later. Due to money losses, WCW was attempting to keep the higher-paid guys under full-time contracts, but filled a card up with wrestlers who would only be guaranteed $300 per show with a minimum of 60 dates, or basically $18,000 in guaranteed income. If the wrestler were to sign, he couldn't work for another company during the period he was under contract. Lex Luger beat Nikita Koloff in a chain match and Stan Hansen pinned Sting in the double main event before 1,000 fans at the Greensboro Coliseum.
Ric Flair wasn't even booked on the show.
Former AWA TV announcer Eric Bischoff was hired by Jim Ross and Herd at WCW to replace Lance Russell as the host of WCW Pro.
Gordon Solie was also let go for the first time by WCW. Ratings for the week saw WCW Saturday Night and WCW Main Event on TBS do 2.5 ratings.
Bill Kazmaier, who may have been the strongest man to ever walk the face of the earth, was signed by WCW. God, what a bunch of great moves all in the same week. A house show at the Omni in Atlanta drew 2,200 headlined by Luger and El Gigante over Flair and one-man gang via DQ in 1620 when Kevin Sullivan interfered to cause a DQ in what was advertised as a stretcher match and called the worst match Flair had ever been involved in. Dud rating in that city. The big match announced for the next show in Atlanta. Seriously, I can't make up stuff this good? Was Paul E. Dangerously versus Jason Hervey, stemming from an angle on a Clash of the Champions. Steve Keirn signed with WWF for a new role as Skinner. Hercules was suspended for failing a drug test.
WWF held a bodybuilding contest for the old WBF which drew 4,200 fans.
On television, they claimed the attendance was 15,000.
WWF drew 5,000 fans at the Boston Gardens for a show headlined by Ultimate Warrior over Undertaker via DQ and Jake Roberts over Earthquake.
Minneapolis drew 6,500 for the same crew.
Los Angeles drew 10,100 for Hogan over Sergeant Slaughter and Iron Sheik as Colonel Mustafa over Jim Duggan. 25 years ago, in many ways, the most famous match up to that point in wrestling history took place at Tokyo Budokan Hall.
Muhammad Ali, easily the most famous sports figure in the world, faced Antonio Inoki, who, as it turned out, was the most enduring wrestling star of our lifetime, in a match which ended up being a shoot and wound up as a 15-round draw. It was the first legitimate $1 million live gate in history and probably the first legitimate high-profile pro wrestling match in decades as well.
The event was closed-circuited around the United States, to generally weak box office, except in the Northeast where the return of Bruno Sammartino from a legit broken neck to beat Stan Hansen at Shea Stadium as part of the regional pro wrestling feed underneath drew more than 32,000 fans.
It was the first national closed-circuit pro wrestling event in history, and the last until the first WrestleMania 9 years later.
The match was considered an outright disaster at the time, as bad as the worst UFC or Pride matches ever where two people were so wary of the other they wouldn't engage in combat.
Still, because Inoki was in legitimate combat with the most famous boxer of all time, he always considered it as both his scariest career moment and a career highlight. The match was never supposed to be real.
A finish was worked out where Inoki would pin Ali after an enzui-jiri, but scripted for Ali to save face in the United States by showing compassion for Inoki, who he was going to devastate, before the surprise ending. When Ali got to Japan a few days before the event, he got cold feet about doing the job, and eventually refused. The fight was nearly called off, but with so much money at stake for all sides, not having the fight itself because of all the expenses would have probably meant the end of New Japan Pro Wrestling, and greatly hurt many of the US promoters who were heavily invested in the venture. The two actually got into the ring,
scared to death of each other, in a shoot. Numerous rules were implemented by Ali's side, fearful of damage to Ali, which handicapped Inoki greatly, including him being unable to do any submissions or many throws, nor punch since he wasn't wearing gloves. Inoki would have been able to take Ali down like a wrestler and pin him, but fearful of the punches, Inoki rarely tried and spent most of the match laying on his back throwing leg kicks. Ali went down a few times but was quick enough to always scramble for the ropes before Inoki could tie him up, thus getting a restart. There was actually a ton of intensity in the early rounds, even with little action. That's how big the match was in Japan, and how big Ali was in the US. But as the match progressed and little changed, crowds were furious at the closed circuit locations. When it was over, fans were more than that, and in Japan, the damage was so great that both Inoki and the pro wrestling business took a major short-term hit, although both ended up rebounding in many ways bigger than ever when a series of martial artists over the next few years were brought into Japan to put Inoki over in more action-packed matches. History has been very kind to this match, both in Japan, and now is considered the biggest event in the history of that country's pro wrestling and even in the American martial arts world, where many consider this match the birth of mixed martial arts and a legendary battle. Most in pro wrestling in the US simply would like to forget it ever took place. Today, because of more knowledge of the art of low kicks and the strategy of the butt scoot, while still unpopular among spectators but at least acknowledged as part of fighting, had the same match taken place, Inoki would have easily won the decision since Ali's legs took tremendous damage, and those close to him have credited it with all the broken blood vessels in the leg, which saw Ali hospitalized after the fight, led to shortening Ali's effective career. In Japan, where the match aired live on network television, it drew a 54.6 rating, a number pro wrestling has never even approached since that time. Ali was supposed to earn $6 million, which at the time would have been the largest purse ever paid to a combat athlete, but only received $1.8 million due to the event not doing good box office in the US due to Inoki being unknown. It was still the most money anyone earned doing a pro wrestling gig until Mike Tyson's $3.5 million payoff for being guest referee at WrestleMania 14. For back issues of The Observer, the Wrestling Observer Index lists almost every issue in our history going back more than 18 years with the major headlines by the week. Besides as a guide for ordering back issues, the index is also a great way to keep a catalog of past issues and use for historical purposes. It is available for $15 from Grand Swarich, 151 Hart Avenue, Peterborough, Ontario, K9J5C5 Canada.
Virtually every back issue from 1982-91 is available from him at prices listed plus $5 for postage for overseas orders.
Most issues from 1992 present are available from us at $4 per issue. If you are ordering back issues from us, please denote back issues on the envelope to ensure the quickest response. All payments to Grant or to us must be made in U.S. funds. We are also working with Powerbomb Publishing, www.powerbomb.com, to have reissues of some of the most popular Wrestling Observer publications of the past. We have the 200-page book Tributes, featuring life stories on Andre the Giant Bruiser Brody, Junkyard Dog Brian Pillman, Louis Piccoli, Dick the Bruiser, Buddy Rogers, Kerry Von Erich, Fritz Von Erich, Boris Malenko, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, John Studd, Ray Stevens, Dick Murdoch, Jerry Graham and others for $25. We have 1987, 1988, 1989 and 1990 Observer yearbooks for $15. We have 1983, 1984, and 1986 Observer yearbooks for $12. We also have the 1986 Wrestling Observer's Who's Who in Wrestling book for $20. For each order, add $4 for postage and handling within North America, $6 for surface mail worldwide or $14 for airmail overseas. If you are ordering more than one book, you only need to add $1 extra postage per additional book. All payments should be made to Powerbomb at P.O. Box 1523, Scarborough, North Carolina 27510. Wrestling Observer Live airs every Monday through Friday on the ayata.com sports channel on the internet from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time and 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific Time. The show is available live throughout the world, and the most recent show is available 24 hours per day on archives to listen to at your convenience. Brian Alvarez and I open the show every day running down the latest news. We either have guests the remainder of the show taking listeners' phone calls and emails, or we take calls and emails. Even if you don't have access to a computer and just want to talk wrestling, you can reach us between those hours within North America at 1-877-392-3200, 1-877-AYATA-99. You can always check the WrestlingObserver.com website for the latest guest information. We're also on every Saturday and Sunday with Jeff Minden Lavronsky Audio Wrestling on Talk 640 in Toronto, usually at about 5:15 p.m. on Saturday and midnight on Sundays with the Wrestling Observer Extra. Pro Wrestling Noah. Estimated average attendance May 1, 2,640. April 2001 2,386. Estimated average gate May 1st $106,875. April 2001 $76,343. Percentage of house shows sold out May 1st 37.5. April 2001 28.6. Average television rating May 1st 1.43. April 2001 2.53. Mexico. Electroshock won the Mexican light heavyweight title from Hector Garza on June 15 in Tijuana. They're building up a big singles match on June 28 in Guadalupe, NL with the sons of probably the two most famous luchadors ever, El Hijo del Santo vs. Blue Demon Jr. This may be their first ever singles match. Dr. Wagner Jr. agreed to lose his mask to La Parca in late July in Nuevo Laredo for a $30,000 payoff at first, but now has backed out of the program. Arena Mexico on June 22 saw Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Black Tiger and Mr. Niebla over Shocker and Black Warrior and Dr. Wagner Jr. via DQ with the main focus on Tiger vs. Wagner, which is of course a battle of brothers. June 29 has Rayo Jr. and Villano 3 and Gigante Silva vs. Los Hermanos Dinamita and Apollo Dantes plus Lismark Jr. and Black Tiger and El Hijo de Rayo Jr. vs. Wagner and Charles and Fuerza Guerrera. Villano 3 won a bloodbath hair vs. hair old-style lucha stips match on June 21 in Naucalpan over Rambo. The ring was said to have been soaked in blood and the newspapers reported Rambo was bleeding like a river. Several times the doctor examined Rambo, teasing a finish, but ruling he could continue until finally, it was so bloody it was stopped. Conan was working this past week on getting clearance to wrestle. He may start as early as this week in Tijuana and is billed on the June 29 show, although at press time he still had one more political hurdle to clear. The reason so many of the big stars are working on Fridays in Tijuana instead of Arena Mexico is because Tijuana, because of its proximity to the U.S., has a far stronger economy than Mexico City. Headliners like Santo and La Parca earn twice as much in Tijuana. On June 29 in Tijuana they're doing a three-way where the loser drops his hair with Halloween vs. Rey Mysterio vs. Damien, and the loser is getting a $12,000 payoff for their hair. Conan's return is in an all-face match teaming with Pentagon and Nicho versus Santo and Blue Demon Jr. and Parka. Vampiro's knee ligament tear isn't as serious as thought, and he'll be back in 1 month. The June 22 Tijuana show was from Promociones Moro with Los Hermanos Dinamita beating Atlantis and Lismark and El Hijo de Rayo de Jalisco Jr. via DQ. They had what may have been a first, a mask and hair versus mask and hair singles match where Kato Kung Lee Jr. beat Conquistador. So Conquistador unmasked, revealing himself as Guillermo Velasquez Gonzalez of Guadalajara. Then after the announcement was made revealing who he was, then they shaved his head as well. The Zlaw Tour finished drawing 1,544 in Tlalnepantla on June 15th, and 805th in Tultitan on June 17th. On June 15th, Halloween and Damien won the Zlaw tag titles from Mosco de la Merced and De Predador. Puerto Rico. New rules were laid out by the Wrestling Commission, which is now independent of the Boxing Commission. Among them are all wrestlers are required to have 2 drug tests per year, hepatitis B and C testing twice per year, HIV testing twice per year, and that they want all wrestlers, even if they are only working one date, to have written contracts with the promoters for all matches. This is because the commission, which is government funded, has a fund to pay wrestlers if the promoters stiff them. Kind of hard to believe that Puerto Rico has actually just about the strictest regulating body when it comes to pro wrestling. Well, except that blading is mandatory. Some commissions don't allow blading. WWC drew 3,500 on June 16 in Carolina, Puerto Rico for a show which ended with the Universal title held up between Rey Gonzalez and Super Gladiator after a DDQ match. Also, El Nene wound up as hardcore champ. Champ One Man Gang missed the weekend shows, so he was stripped of the title. He was supposed to do a 3-way with Nene and Carlos Colon, so it was a straight single with Nene using a foreign object to win the title. True story. There was a masked underneath wrestler for WWC called Mr. X, who in real life was a preacher. Word got out to someone, who called his supervisor saying he was a masked heel wrestler, and has to give up his moonlighting wrestling gig. Newcomers to WWC are the New York Hit Squad, who are 2 of UFA's students from Pennsylvania, who came with Lloyd Anoya, who is back as Tahitian Warrior. Iniwa Hombre Dinamita Savio Vega beat Pharaon Zarux to win their hardcore title, but Zarux, now called La Momia Zarux, doing a mummy gimmick, regained the title on June 23 in Bayamon. Also, Super Crazy regained the Iwa Jr. title from Andy Anderson on that show, while the tag titles also changed hands as champs D'Lo Brown and Shane lost to Miguel Perez and Huracan Castillo Jr. in a 3-way with Pete Gas and Shane as the other team. Tag title change probably precipitated by Brown likely not having that much time left in the area. World title program saw Apollo retain pinning Tiger Ali Singh with lots of outside interference. Latest ratings for last week saw June 16th, WWC did a 12.6, IWA 9.6 and WWF Metal did a 10.6. For June 17th, WWC did a 13.3 and IWA did a 9.6. Pro Wrestling Noah. It appears they are wanting to do an angle on the July 27th Budokan show, which would be Mitsuharu Misawa versus Jun Akiyama for the GHC title, and Akiyama would invite Yuji Nagata to come to ringside to watch, similar to Nagata inviting Akiyama to watch his title loss to Kazuyuki Fujita. The match was set up in the tour finale on June 24 in Nagoya Aichi Gym before a crowd announced at 5,400, probably significantly less, with Akiyama and Akitoshi Saito over Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa in the main event in 23-22 when Akiyama pinned the GHC champ after an offshoot of his Exploder. Yoshinobu Kanemaru became the first GHC junior champ with a pin on Juventud Guerrera in 17-17 in the tournament final. 2 other undercard surprises as Daisuke Ikeda pinned Takao Omori in 13-33 when Omori went for an armbar, but Ikeda surprised him with a roll. They had been building up the idea that if Omori beat Ikeda, he'd get a shot at Misawa's title. The other minor surprise was Takuma Sano pinning Takeshi Rikyo. Sano in a sense would be the favorite since he's a veteran, but Rikyo really picked up a loss of team when he did so well in the 0-1 pay-per-view main event. Kenta Kobashi held a press conference on June 26. He was having trouble walking and said it wouldn't be until 2002 before he could return. To make the pressure on his ravaged knees better, he's dropped from 266 pounds down to 233. The semifinals of the junior tourney on June 23 at Differ Ariaki saw Guerrera pin Namichi Marufuji in 1902 of what was reported as a great match after a Juvie driver off the top rope, the Juvie vs Blitzkrieg pay-per-view finish, and Kanemaru pinned Tsuyoshi Kikuchi with a moonsault in 13-34. In the other junior tourney matches this week, on June 20th at Korakuen Hall, Guerrera beat Satoru Asako in 11:04, and on June 21st in Toyama, Kikuchi pinned BJ Whitmer in 7:12.
Also on the June 24th show in the undercard, they honored Rusher Kimura, who turned 60, for being the oldest active wrestler in the world.
Kimura is the third Japanese wrestler to ever wrestle past the age of 60, the others being Giant Baba and Mr. Chin. The magazines were really pushing Mark Smith, Donovan Morgan and Michael Modest as coming in from APW, along with Dilip Singh, a 7-foot January 2nd inch, 374-pound guy with a bodybuilder physique.
I doubt there's anyone in the world that has ever lived quite like him. I think Singh is actually already being directed toward New Japan through the Barry Bloom connection, as Brad Reingens and Masa Saito were in Hayward, California last week scouting him.
He's a phenomenon in still photos, but as we've seen, it's a different era, and just being large, with a good physique and agile alone won't get you there if you can't wrestle, and he's very new at this. Plus, being from India, he's just learning the English language, which will hurt him for the United States, so Japan may be where he winds up.
But that's a problem as well, because the work standard in Japan is so high that it's difficult for someone who can't hang these days to fit in, even if they have freakish size. I know somebody will bring up Scott Norton, but he got over in a different era when a huge powerhouse physique could get you over, and when he came up, there were phenomenal workers like Hiroshi Hayes out there who made him appear to be much better than he was. June 15th, TV didn't even air anything from the GHC tourney.
They focused it around the Jumbo Tsuruta tribute show. For reasons I can't even fully figure out, that Tsuruta death is, to me, the saddest of all the wrestler deaths. I think that even the wrestlers who died that were friends of mine in some form, lived wild lives, and while it's very sad they died, left young children behind, it is a risk you'd hate being wrapped up in drugs, or being confrontational.
Tsuruta was this all-time great performer and one of the most underrated athletes this business has ever seen, a main eventer from day one, who made good money, but never the kind of money he probably deserved, as being the cornerstone of one of the greatest companies ever and making so many guys into stars by his rub. Nature dealt him a bad hand and his career was cut down in his prime. At the time he may have been the best wrestler in the world, and he had years left and would have added so much considering how the company flourished as far as great matches as the 90s went on.
And he was basically forced out of the company and started a new life out of wrestling in a new country that he apparently was doing well at, and then died, leaving a young family behind. His brother was in the ring while wrestlers paid respect to him. His brother was crying a lot. Misawa and Ogawa beat Tao and Sugawara in a good match. Misawa pulled out a lot of moves. Technically everything was fine, but Misawa really lacks fire because of all the pain he's in. Crowd doesn't get behind him because they sense it, unless it's a dream match situation. Ogawa pinned Sugawara with a back suplex, and they made it clear the back suplex was a tribute to Tsuruta, his winning move in the 80s.
2 3/4 stars. Kanemaru and Akiyama and Akitoshi Saito beat Marufuji and Sano and Ikeda.
Only the finish aired, with Kanemaru wrestling in his hometown, pinning Marufuji after a moonsault.
Only clips aired, but looked good. The other thing they showed was just the angle where Omori interfered, causing Akiyama to do the pinfall job to Rikyo in the tag match on June 9th, and then Rikyo and Takeshi Morishima were mad at Omori because they didn't want the help.
New Japan.
New Japan held its annual stockholders meeting on June 21st.
It was largely uneventful. The company made a $1.5 million profit after paying out bonuses to company employees. For tax purposes, the company always keeps its profit margin low. Over the past year, the basic viewpoint was the main revenue stream. House show gates were considered good, even though there has been a lot of publicity over the past year because some of the biggest shows haven't sold out buildings they normally do and poor attendance at some dome shows. New Japan is still talking about doing an IPO. No position changes were announced.
Riki Choshu from a public standpoint has maintained his position, even though he's voluntarily given up his power.
Tatsumi Fujinami will remain company president and Tetsuo Baisho remains managing director.
Choshu was at the meeting. Katsuji Nagashima said at the meeting that at the July 20th Sapporo Dome show, that Choshu, Shinya Hashimoto, Naoya Ogawa and Kazuyuki Fujita would appear besides the matches already announced. However, Hashimoto said he wouldn't wrestle any more matches in New Japan and would concentrate on his own shows since New Japan is no longer sending talent to his shows. Ogawa turned down the proposed match against Manabu Nakanishi.
The biggest news coming out of the meeting is that New Japan Corporation is absorbing New Japan Service Corporation, which had been a separate company, which was the merchandising arm, headed by former wrestler, trainer and announcer Kotetsu Yamamoto.
Merchandising as a separate business did go down over the last year.
The other big news, which was pretty well known before, is that New Japan would open up a new training center in Los Angeles to train foreign talent. The belief seems to be that the biggest name American talent is already with WWF, and the non-WWF American talent doesn't transition well into New Japan style, which is totally different than anything being done at the indie level in the US, so they would rather take top-level athletes such as MMA fighters and train them in their style and become their guys, like Don Frye and Brian Johnston, then use American pro wrestlers, whose goals would be to get into WWF. 5 more matches have been officially announced for the July 20th Sapporo Dome show besides the 3, Muto vs. Chono, Mark Coleman vs. Yuji Nagata, and Minoru Tanaka vs. Masayoshi Naruse for IWGP Junior title, announced last week. They are Kazuyuki Fujita vs. Don Frye for the IWGP Heavyweight title, which is a lot better choice than Gary Goodridge for that spot, since Frye can have a good match with him, fits the shooter bill they want the title to revolve around now, but isn't a Pride undercard guy. Goodridge will instead face Nakanishi, which should be a good win that Nakanishi needs over a shooter after the Fukuoka Dome fiasco hurt his shooter rep. Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan vs. Jinsei Shinzaki and Taiokiya. This wasn't announced as a tag title match but may become one. Jushin Liger and El Samurai vs. Gedo and Jado for IWGP Junior tag titles. Last bout announced was Michiyoshi Ohara vs. Tadao Yasuda. This will probably be work-shoot style, as Ohara is the next one they are trying to get over with the shooter aura. There are 2 or 3 more matches left to be announced. They also want to do more interpromotional stuff with Pro Wrestling Noah, starting with Jun Akiyama appearing on big shows. Mitsuharu Misawa has never done business with Antonio Inoki, dating back to being indoctrinated almost from childhood in the Baba/Inoki feud. In what sounds like an angle, but most feel wasn't, at the June 23rd King of the Cage show in San Jacinto, California, there was a confrontation between Frye and Tim Catalfo, former UFC judge. Catalfo, who is 42, surprised a hell of a lot of people by pounding former UFC star Dave Beneteau to death with rights, then used a guillotine to choke him out in the first round. Catalfo, who has trained people like Mark Coleman, Kevin Randleman and Bill Goldberg, and was at one point seriously considered as being brought into WCW as the ultimate martial arts coach, kind of a real-life Mikey for Rocky type of angle with Goldberg, then pointed to Frye in Beneto's corner and made some comments. Frye got in the ring and shoved Catalfo, and everyone ran in between them as they did a stare down. Apparently the two had major heat over some underground fighting event in Atlanta many years ago. Ken Shamrock and Alexander Otska did a pro wrestling angle at the couch to build up their Pride match. There's a lot of talk in the MMA world about a Frye vs. Coleman match at Pride. The two fought once in UFC at the end of a tournament 5 years ago, and Coleman won, which was Frye's only loss of his MMA career. Frye, 35, hasn't had a shoot fight since late 1996, when he broke his hand in winning Ultimate, and when training to return, ended up signing with New Japan, where he's worked for the past 4 years. At King of the Cage, Frye was telling people his New Japan contract expired on June 30th and he was looking at going into either Pride or UFC. He also had interest in WWF, but they didn't seem to have an interest in him. But his doing the Dome show seems to indicate he's sticking with New Japan, at least for now. The current tour opened June 22nd in Nagaoka. The main event saw Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima beat Liger and Yuji Nagata and Shiro Koshinaka. Gedo and Jado issued the challenge to Liger and Samurai before the match for the IWGP Junior Tag titles. After the match, they jumped Liger, and Samurai made the save for Liger to set up their angle, but they ended up unmasking Samurai. After finishing up previously booked dates with other promotions, Gedo and Jado start on this tour on June 28th. June 9th TV show did a 2.8 rating. Other Japan notes. Atsushi Onita was a major tabloid news topic over the past week. Onita was being recruited by the Gyudo Party, a liberal party, to run for the House of Councilors and receive $300,000 in cash under the table for a campaign budget. After privately indicating he would run, he told the party due to his having health problems, he wouldn't be able to run. A few days later, he announced he would be running as a member of the Jiminto, a more conservative party which is the same party of Hiroshi Hei's party. The story was that the conservatives simply made a higher bid for him and he switched his political viewpoints. Within the Japanese political world, Onita has gained a very shady rep, and now both parties have become publicly embarrassed when the word got out they were bidding for him. More on Toriuman's first pay-per-view show, which is July 1st in Kobe. They are only charging 980 yen, about $8, for the show.
Top matches are Masaaki Mochizuki defending the British Commonwealth Junior title against Magnum Tokyo, who has to leave Toriuman if he loses, Shima and Suwa and Big Fuji defending the old Uwa Trios titles against Great Sasuke and Tiger Mask and Dick Togo, although Togo just turned on Sasuke in Michinoku Pro, so that may change.
Darkness Dragon British Columbia's Brett Como and Susumu Mochizuki and Yasushi Kanda vs Dragon Kid and Ryo Saito and Ricky Marvin. Stoker Ichikawa vs Taro, comedy match, Kenichiro Arai vs Chocoflake Kaiichi and Genki Horiguchi vs Gran Apache. 01 has scheduled 2 spot shows on July 12th and July 13th in Tokyo at a small building called Zepp Tokyo.
The match to determine NWA Intercontinental Tag Champs with Steve Corino and Mike Rapata defending against Shinjiro Otani and Yuki Ishikawa takes place on July 12th, which will likely be the setup if there is going to be a Corino vs Otani NWA title program.
Masato Tanaka debuts as well. Complete card for July 12th is Hashimoto and Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs Alexander Otsuka and Katsumi Yujuda. The NWA IC Tag Title match, Tom Howard UPW vs Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Tanaka vs The Cobra, Gyoji Takano, Kohei Sato vs Lee Young-gun and Naohiro Hoshikawa vs Ikuto Hidaka. Next night has Otani vs Tanaka as the main event, Fujiwara and Ishikawa vs Howard and Young-gun, Hoshikawa vs Otsuka, Cobra vs Kazunari Murakami, Hidaka and Yujuda vs Corino and Rapata and Sato vs Takaiwa. Pancrase on July 29th at Korakuen Hall will be doing its annual afternoon and evening double event Neo Blood Tournament. Yujuda won a shoot match via submission with an ankle lock over Shannon Rich in the first round at the same June 23rd King of the Cage where Fry head into the skirmish in San Jacinto, California. Rich is a shoot-fighting journeyman who lost in about 1 minute to Kazushi Sakuraba on October 31st when they were trying to give Sakuraba an easy opponent when he was on fire in between Gracie family members. Pancrase ran June 26th at Korakuen Hall with the main event of Sanae Kikuta using an armbar in 111 against 37-year-old two-time Australian boxing champion Matt Trihey. Michinoku Pro show an angle on June 23rd in Sendai with a singles main event where Gedo pinned Great Sasuke thanks to interference from Dick Togo, who turned on Sasuke, and after the match Gedo said since he beat Sasuke, he would no longer wrestle in Michinoku Pro. JWP wrestler Misaki Kana, 27, announced her retirement on June 24th. Her final match will be on July 5th and her ceremony will be July 29th. This is really strange. Deep, the shoot organization which is running August 18th at Yokohama Bunka Gym with Kengo of Pancrase vs Dos Cars Jr., this week announced the original Kato Kung Lee, Johnny Lozcano, would fight on the show. Lee now 52, but he's lived a hard life and looks a lot older, had a big-time tough guy rep in Mexican pro wrestling about 20 years ago, but it sounds ridiculous on the surface he'd be doing a shoot match. Gamma won the Osaka Pro title from Super Delphin on June 24th in Osaka. Here and there. The state of North Carolina is looking at expanding the scope of the Boxing Commission to include both pro wrestling and MMA as well as tough man contests and kickboxing. The economic idea is that the commission could be more self-sufficient through tax revenues from all these sports as opposed to only boxing, and this would also give the commission power to regulate all those activities as opposed to only boxing. The State House of Representatives on June 20th voted 77-36 for the bill, which has to be approved next by the Senate and then signed by the governor. Boxing Commissioner Sean Lemon said in an article in the Charlotte Observer that both sports should be regulated for both safety and economic reasons. He said without regulation, because of the direction of wrestling, there would be more injuries to both fans and spectators if it isn't kept until control. Wrestling as an industry is becoming more and more extreme for the market share, he said. Spectators at small shows have been seriously injured by errant chairs. The legislation is poorly written as a pro wrestling match is defined as a match where the participants engage in full contact wrestling techniques, and a fee for viewing the match is charged or solicited, or a purse or prize is awarded to the contestant. The law would also ban dangerous Ultimate Warrior matches. The first state to actually ban Jim Hellwig? No, seriously, that exactly is how the law is worded. An Ultimate Warrior match is defined as a match where the participants use any combination of boxing, wrestling, hitting, punching or other combative contact techniques in which combination of techniques is not specifically authorized by and conducted pursuant to this as opposed to a pro wrestling match which no skill is demonstrated, and the winning participant blows up before getting into the ring, before disappearing into a cloud on dust and using a dangerous trap door in the pro wrestling ring.
See, if you think about it, with all the injuries that damn door caused, it legit should have banned by athletic commissions. Although you can't protect promoters in legislation from their own stupidity when it comes to bad booking and ruining entertainment, but you should protect participants from needless injury.
A mixed martial arts match is defined as a match where the participants engage in full contact martial arts techniques, and a fee for viewing the match is charged or solicited.
Boys, they're going to be hell to pay trying to figure out the difference in this law of an MMA match and an Ultimate Warrior match, and up until this week, there was never any confusion about that.
As it pertains to wrestling and MMA, promoters are required to post a bond of $5,000 to keep them from skipping town without paying, as part of getting a promoter's license, a good thing.
They need to provide for medical insurance of $2,500 or post a cash bond for $2,500 per person that appears on the show.
Announcers, participants, judges, managers, bookers, promoters, referees and timekeepers have to be licensed and pay an annual fee ranging from $25 for a participant to $350 for a promoter if they book a 15,000-seat arena. If promoters arrange pro wrestling events as volunteers, as in the staff and promoters don't make a profit, they are exempt from having to pay an annual licensing fee. At this point in time, out of 52 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, even though they are technically not states, 47 regulate boxing, 25 regulate pro wrestling, and 18 regulate MMA.
If the bill becomes law, it would be effective on January 1st. As with every legislation attempt, the pro wrestling community is against it, claiming it will kill the business and that the WWF might pull out of the state. Of course, in the states that do have such regulations, the business is in most cases just as alive, and the only place WWF doesn't run due to regulations is Oregon, because of the drug testing, which isn't part of this law. And the MMA community wants it to pass. The Memphis group seems to be planning a big return show, as they did an angle on the June 23rd TV show where Lawler went to smash Jimmy Hart's car unless he agreed to a match, which would be Lawler versus Lord Humongous Emery Hale, where Hart puts up his Cadillac, Lawler puts up the original Southern heavyweight title belt, key belt in the territory in the glory years, and the rights to use the name King, so if Humongous wins, Hart becomes the king, and that Hart can pick the ref, since Lance Russell did a fast count for the finish. Vampiro is off the Chicago Fantasy Camp because he'll be on tour that week with All Japan. The Linda Marks Keeble Group is returning to Boutwell Auditorium in Birmingham on August 11th with a double main event of Robert Fuller and Jimmy Golden and Jerry Stubbs versus Ron Fuller and Bob and Scott Armstrong, plus Terry Gordy and Tommy Rich versus Buddy Landell and Dirty White Boy in a Southeastern Championship Wrestling 1980s reunion type of show with angles stemming from the June 9th show. The Wrestle Express show on October 20th in Coventry, England has added Steve Corino, Vampiro, Chima, Dragon Kid, Magnum Tokyo and Kurt Hennig to the list of people appearing. Rob Van Dam has been pulled from the show since he's going to WWF. Jacques Rougeau's promotion in Montreal is doing a halftime show on August 10th during the Montreal Alouettes vs. Winnipeg Blue Bombers CFL game and are planning their biggest show ever at the Molson Theatre in early October, provided he can book big-name outsiders. For some reason I read that Hulk Hogan. A lot of controversy surrounds a June 23rd show from the FMLL promotion in Los Angeles. The group, which had been using big-name Mexican independent talent, had scheduled its first show using AAA talent. According to people within the promotion, at 3 a.m. the previous night, promoter Carlos Zamora received word from R. Arikelian that the AAA wrestlers wouldn't be coming, and had to scramble at the last minute to use locals to fill the show. Others are saying the promoter had friends who knew 2 weeks ahead of time that AAA was going to pull the talent. The deal is that Carlos Arikelian has the promotional rights to AAA in the United States, and Los Angeles is their key market. FMLO was contacted by Carlos Arikelian a month before about working together, and they booked 8 wrestlers: Octagon, Heavy Metal, AAA Psicosis, Cibernetico, La Parca Jr., Hysteria, Octagonchito, and Mini Abismo Negro. Those to AAA claim Zamora booked the wrestlers independently and not through the office, and when Arikelian got the word, he contacted Antonio Pena, who told the wrestlers they couldn't appear. When they were still being advertised up until the day before the event, AAA contacted the promotion itself and told them nobody was coming. Arikelian is planning on going back to the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles for a swing in September, which would also possibly be routed with shows in San Jose and Fresno. Zamora was able, at the last minute, to get help from the local WPW and Revolution Pro companies to save the show. They put up flyers at the building in El Monte, CA, and listed the new card and let everyone know Lucha is primarily walk-up business. The AAA wrestlers wouldn't be appearing, and did offer refunds to those who purchased tickets in advance. They also lowered the ticket prices and drew about 500 fans, so the loss on the show was in the $1,000 range. They are planning a return show on July 8th with Mil Mascaras, Tinieblas Jr., and Rey Mysterio.
AAA was able to draw close to 3,000 for its recent shows in both Phoenix and Albuquerque a few weeks back, so they are still putting up numbers ahead of anyone except WWF when it comes to promoting pro wrestling in the US. There are people who believe AAA will have more staying power than in the mid-90s, when it drew far bigger crowds, but fizzled out.
The difference between now and then, at least of their belief, is that the Mexican population in the US has increased greatly over the past 7 years and Galavision's penetration has more than doubled over the same period.
The costs are also lower because AAA in those days had big money, by the standards. Wrestlers like Conan, Santo, Love Machine, Eddie Guerrero, Pero Arguello, Cien Caras, and used some Americans like Jake Roberts. Now the payroll is much lower, as AAA's top wrestlers like Hector Garza and Cibernetico make the equivalent of $500 to $600 per week.
John Molinaro of Slam Wrestling wrote an article with Sharon Wisniewski-Valentine, talking about Johnny, who was very bitter with the wrestling profession for just how little publicly was done to acknowledge the death and contributions of her husband. The two of them with such a hard life after Johnny's career ended, to the point they often lived on beans and rice for 30 days at a time.
Arnold Anderson will be wrestling on July 14th for Border City Wrestling in Windsor, ONT at the Riverfront Civic Terrace, doing a tag match teaming with Lance Storm against Cyrus and Booker Scott D'Amore. The Houston Chronicle on June 20th ran a story on former WWF wrestler Tony Norris, Ahmed Johnson. Norris is doing his fourth movie, a VH1 movie called Hammer, about the rise, fall and rise of MC Hammer. Norris plays Suge Knight, the huge owner of Death Row Records. Well, he couldn't exactly play a small guy, could he? Tom Lister, Zeus for you 80s WWF aficionados, was one of the people Norris beat out for the role. He's got another movie upcoming called Cons, which has its irony. Norris did say that he misses pro wrestling.
I'm not sure pro wrestling misses him.
Michael Modest won the North American title from Bruce Hart on June 21st in Lethbridge, Alberta, before 140 fans on a show headlined by Lance Storm over Christopher Daniels, but they switched it back the next night in Calgary before 300 fans. When Bruce regained the title, he dedicated his win to Owen and Pillman. Here is where the downside of Matrats comes in.
Jack Evans, who worked the first 2 nights of the tour, was injured and hospitalized at the Calgary show after the opposing team valet, Natalie Neidhart, Ellie and Jim's daughter, gave him a reverse Rana after the match, and he landed on the top of his head and was knocked out and motionless for a long time, eventually going out on a stretcher. When you have 16-year-olds doing high-risk stunts, and I know they do them and they may be more dangerous in X Games type of competition, there is a real injury possibility, and one bad one can result in some very negative backlash. The Calgary match, which was Harry Smith, Davey's son, and Ted Hart and TJ Wilson over Jake and Jack Evans and Marky Starr, was said to have been a 4 stars match. Tons of innovative moves, and Jack Evans and Starr have natural charisma. They drew 322 on June 24th in Medicine Hat and 75 on June 24th in Drumheller.
Modest won the Pacific title the final night from Hart, which means he's scheduled to come back. Correction on Brian Blair from the item a few weeks ago. Blair's age is 43. MMA. The planned debut in Las Vegas for UFC was moved up a week to September 22nd, which will be the next card.
Nevada will be holding a public hearing on July 23rd to have the official commission vote on regulating and accepting the rules of MMA as a sport. Denver is now being considered, as well as Honolulu, for Pride's U.S. debut, also scheduled for September.
In a total pro wrestling style promotion, K1 star Jerome LeBanner talked about a proposed match in Pride with Kazuyuki Fujita. He claimed that Pride is gay boy style fighting and that he wants to fight Fujita on concrete with anything goes, including biting and low blows, and he'd finish it by knocking Fujita out by pounding his head against the concrete floor. Because those in the shoot world aren't used to angles, and brought out a real negative reaction to LeBanner, who will play the heel if they can put the match together. Fujita versus LeBanner would be huge box office in Japan.
LeBanner, who is 6'4" and about 265 pounds, is, along with Mike Bernardo, the hardest puncher in kickboxing anywhere in the world. Fujita has a tremendous ability to take a punch, but he's never taken a punch with anywhere close to LeBanner's power.
Of course, if LeBanner can't block a takedown, he'd better get that punch in right away.
2 nights later at the June 24th K1 show in Sendai, where LeBanner headlined, winning a unanimous decision over Stefan Liko, promoter Kazuyoshi Ishii said that they had started negotiations with Antonio Inoki to do a program where he would send the top K1 fighters to take on Inoki's pro wrestling team from Pride.
Fujita, Naoya Ogawa, Masaaki Sadake and Tadao Yasuda, but that the two sides have to come up with a compromise for the rules. There is one precedent for K1 versus Pride, well actually two if you consider Sadake as a former K1 star who later became a Pride regular, main event. On March 15, 1988 at Yokohama Arena for the second Pride event, Mark Kerr headlined against Bronco Sikatic, who was the 1993 K1 Grand Prix champion. It was a total mess as Sikatic was disqualified in just 2:14 as he refused to let go of the ropes while Kerr was attempting to take him down, which killed what was already a bad show. Ishii announced a big show on July 20 at Nagoya Rainbow Hall and another on August 19 at the Saitama Super Arena. There are rumors that Inoki would come to the Nagoya Dome to shoot an angle to build for Saitama, where they'd like Ogawa or Fujita, since Saitama is considered a home base for Pride. If they can put together Fujita versus Le Banner, this could be the show since Le Banner is booked on that show. There was a UFC versus Pride match in a strange location over the weekend, which was the U.S. National Greco-Roman team trials to determine the members of the team that will go for the World Championships in Madison Square Garden in late September. At 187 pounds, Matt Lindland, the Olympic silver medalist, beat two-time former Olympian Dan Henderson in two straight matches, the first a 3-2 overtime win and the second by a 3-1 score, both on September 24. Lindland was fresh as the top seed, while Henderson had to win an 8-man tournament on September 23 over the rest of the top contenders to qualify for a best-of-3 series the next day with Lindland. Lindland is a leading contender for the 185-pound title UFC will be creating in September, but would be unavailable for the Las Vegas show now. Henderson is a regular for Pride. At 286 pounds in Greco-Roman, Brian Keck, who was just dropped by the WWF, qualified for the tournament but didn't place. Defending gold medalist Rulon Gardner ended up winning two straight matches by 3-0 scores to make the team. Carmen Electra was signed to help do publicity work for UFC. Trey Telligman, who recently upset Igor Voshankin in Pride, at the age of 36, made his pro boxing debut on June 23, with a first-round knockout over winless Walter Wiggins. WWF. Raw on June 25 in Madison Square Garden promised so much, but I can't say delivered. They were handicapped with all the injuries, but there were still angles people were expecting. They did a good job of building anticipation with McMahon promising something big and Ross telling people to set their VCRs. Theme of the show was MSG was hallowed ground and nobody from WCW had ever set foot in it. Vince was out first and did this diatribe on what the T in Booker T stands for. Must have been the same scriptwriter who wrote that terrible Shane interview a few weeks back where he talked about what the initials WCW stood for, because this was dumb, especially when Vince said troglodyte. Showed a film clip of when his father was inducted into the MSG Hall of Fame with clips of Fred Blassie and Gorilla Monsoon. They got huge pops. I think the clip from the 50s billed as early WWF was actually Blassie versus Rikidozen from Tokyo. They claimed Vince Sr. once promoted 21 straight sellouts in MSG. Not true, by the way. Rhino pinned Test in 432 with a gore into the wall backstage to win the hardcore title. Earlier Test had come off about an 8-foot scaffolding with an elbow through two tables, which didn't look like it did his body much good. Immediately after winning, Mike Awesome ran in and power-bombed Rhino on a ladder. That looked like it felt even worse, and then pinned him to win the hardcore title. X-Pac pinned Jeff Hardy to win the light heavy belt with a backslide with his feet on the ropes in 3:11. Vince claimed that Awesome raped him. No way. There's no portrayal of rape on WWF telecasts. Austin yelled at Vince for not being there the previous night, but they ended up in one of those really creepy embraces. Then they showed clips of Bruno Sammartino. I thought it was the Twilight Zone. Show tried to pick up on Stratus. Show is really funny. He offered to take her on a European vacation. She said she'd go as long as they stayed in separate rooms. There is something about guys getting blown off and not getting the hint that on any television show makes for good entertainment. I think it's guys thinking, see, there's a guy even more of a loser with women than I am and it makes them happy. Angle and Austin started arguing doing an odd couple routine. Real entertaining. They aired a clip of superstar Billy Graham, with Heyman calling him the man who revolutionized sports entertainment. Now I'm sure I'm in the Twilight Zone. Not sure it'll take Angle to where he needs to be. Angle looked so beat up, and then they had him sit down. Taz choked out Richards in 13 seconds. RTC is officially dead, by the way, and they've got no ideas what to do with the cast. King of the Ring ceremony saw Christian play the role of Owen Hart, thinking the trophy is his. Christian complained that Shane cost him the match, but Shane gave Edge the match. Crowd was already dead. Christian claimed he had to get past Show and Kane to make the semis, who together weigh more than a half-ton. He's Canadian. Must be him messing up the conversion from metric. Gunn came out.
Now that'll get the crowd going. Edge cut the most hilarious promo on Gunn, noting that he both sucks and blows at the same time.
He said Gunn was so 2 years ago, which is true. By the way, in that same vein, Montreal is so 4 years ago. So can the WWF please get over it? I know, different timetable. So I'm laughing my ass off, and the crowd in MSG is totally dead. A few people watching with me are dead thinking I'm a geek. All these people are missing the joke until I realize the joke is on us. It's like that night Bischoff was talking to Sid about a squeegee on Nitro. The crowd didn't react. Bischoff, thinking the whole world knows the squeegee story, as opposed to maybe 1% of his audience, thought somehow the mic didn't work, and said it again, and again got this blank reaction from the audience. They tried to get Gunn over with a new character, Bitter Billy. Good luck on that one, guys.
They showed Patterson vs. Slaughter from 1981, calling it one of the greatest matches of all time. When I was in college, that was a classic.
It really doesn't hold up that well today. Dudley's beat Undertaker and Kane to keep the belts in 450. Crowd was dead. Bad match. Everyone seemed real tired and spots were mistimed. Albert gave Kane the Baldo bomb and Devon pinned him.
Undertaker choke slammed Bubba through a table after. Sarah is now Undertaker's manager.
DDP took out Undertaker with 2 chair shots. Sarah wanted to fight Paige. Paige grabbed her and pulled out some of her extensions and ran off. Show beat Matt Hardy via DQ in a European title match in 3:14. Lita kicked Show low for the DQ.
Really, this was just so Stratus could get her shirt pulled off and be left in a bra by Lita.
Shane and Booker T were at WWF New York. Good idea because everyone comes across like a superstar to that audience. T challenged Austin. Vince then told Austin to go over there and kick his ass. APA held a pep rally with all the guys barely clinging to their jobs. We had Goodfather and Bull Buchanan with no gimmicks, Essa Rios, Malenko, Haku, and even underutilized guys like Raven.
Not one guy with any level of stardom was there.
Bradshaw did a great promo basically saying those guys from WCW are trying to jump on their coattails so they can pay for their houses after their company went down and jumping on what we've all built. Sorry, but you guys were all along for the ride for what Austin and Rock built. The one thing great about this is Bradshaw did the perfect interview.
Just should have had a few stars out there to make it seem like not such an NWO black and white loser crew.
Showed Jimmy Snuka's splash on Don Morocco. Do you realize people remember that moment today, and it was 18 years ago? And Benoit and Angle both did dives from a higher height last Monday as transition moves in a match. Edge pinned Gunn in 6:18. Gunn does have a gift when it comes to time travel. He made 6 minutes seem like 60.
No crowd heat at all except the small Goldberg chant when Gunn did a jackhammer, and the much louder Hogan chant because some guys were running around the crowd dressed up like Hogan and Warrior.
Vince was talking to Austin on the cell phone. They got caught in New York traffic and still weren't at WWF New York. And Austin was mad at hanging with Angle. Vince admitted Angle was a dork, but he's a dangerous dork and he's our dork.
Wrestling has been around now for probably 125 years on some form of a contrived basis, and has had many charismatic people who have been huge draws. I don't know anyone any more gifted than Angle.
However, in that time frame, with all the different facets of people who were big drawing cards at one time or another, from evil Russians, to evil sheiks, to ethnic heroes, to muscle-bound clowns, to fat-ass dancers, to super athletes, not one ever portrayed a dork. Jericho beat Tajiri in 5:10 of a good match. Big ECW chant. Tajiri is just so awesome and has so much charisma.
Regal broke up a pin by attacking Hebner and then attacked and held Jericho.
Tajiri went to blow the mist, but it went in Regal's eyes and Jericho pinned Tajiri after a lionsault.
Show ended with Angle and Austin at WWF New York, but Shane and Booker had left.
Vince was in the ring, and they came out. Booker attacked Vince with some of the most hilariously mistimed kicks and bad selling, but Vince can get away with that. I guess if a heel has enough heat, or may enough money, the stuff doesn't have to look good. All the JWO, Jabroni World Order, guys came out and Booker ran off. SmackDown from MSG sounded a hell of a lot better. Linda and Vince did an interview talking about the divorce. This becomes important as the next few weeks go by and the storyline advances, as many have halfway figured out.
Linda suggests interpromotional matches starting next week on TV.
She also suggests changing the pay-per-view name to Invasion, and having interpromotional matches there as well. Edge and Christian beat X-Pac and Gunn when Edge pinned X-Pac with the Impaler DDT. Vince, upon consulting with Austin, agrees to start interpromotional matches next week. They tease Booker about to show up.
Albert pinned Kane to win the IC title when DDP interfered and gave Kane a diamond cutter.
Now we're getting somewhere. Except, now Albert holds the IC title. Hardy's vs Dudley's table match had no winner when Palumbo and O'Hare did a run-in. All the JWO guys destroyed them and left them dead. Sucks to be them. Spike and Molly beat Crash and Jackie when Molly pinned Jackie. Crash made fun of Jackie for losing, so she started beating on him.
The fearsome foursome, Vince, Angle, Austin, and Deborah, were looking for Booker.
They instead found Tori Wilson. Wilson said her WCW contract was about to expire and wants to discuss, with Vince in private, signing a WWF contract. Have you ever noticed that the old men characters on a show, Vince, Hogan, Ric Flair, Nash, or Booker's all politic or book, so they're in some form linked with the hottest women? There is a reason.
They are old enough to know history, and those who know history can also learn from it in a positive way.
You know, like the Benoit/Nancy Sullivan angle, or all the other romances Booker's made up that somehow became real life. Austin acted jealous of Vince, probably because he remembers how his angle with Chris Adams' ex-wife turned out. Show pinned Saturn. Mainly they're so Stratus and Terry could catfight.
Jericho and a mystery partner, who turned out to be Scotty 2 Hotty, beat Tajiri and Regal when 2 Hotty pinned Tajiri after the worm.
There is something so wrong about that. Show finale is Austin challenging Booker to come out. Booker is playing mind games. Austin goes off. Finally Taz gets up from announcing and tells Austin to apologize for what he did to Michael Cole. Austin refuses to apologize, so Taz says he's going to beat it out of him. Almost can't resist the Missy Hyatt joke here. Think they'll be doing a title match on Raw. Austin ended up hitting Taz with the belt to lay him out. Cole checks on Big Buddy.
Austin is about to lay waste to him again, when just before he can, Booker comes out and hits Austin with the WCW title belt, and runs through the crowd with the JWO chasing him, and hops in the WCW limo, and the show ends. Nuevo Gran Apollo German Figueroa, the current Iwa champ in Puerto Rico, worked a tryout match beating Devon Storm, who wore his crowbar gimmick. Storm, who fans knew, got a good reaction. The FBI beat Danny during and Roadkill in an ECW match. Fans were really into this match and was good. Takamichi Noku appeared to have injured his arm in a Kaientai vs. Holly's tag match. Funaki worked the entire match after the injury and Taka was favoring his arm while being helped to the back. The reason there was a loud Hogan chant during the Edge vs. Gunn match was because two fans were running around the arena with a Hulk Rules sign and dressed up as Hogan and Ultimate Warrior. Just for a clarification on Goldberg's status, his Time Warner contract is not assignable, which means even if WWF wanted him and was willing to buy out the remainder of his deal, he is under no obligation to go. Whoever negotiated that contract for him is someone everyone should have as an agent. Oh yeah, everyone already has him, Barry Bloom. Nobody's ever getting another one like that. Foley vs. Regal is planned for the Invasion pay-per-view, but not sure Foley has agreed to it yet because the reaction seems tepid when it comes to strongly pushing that angle. Tough Enough debuted on June 21st to an almost universal great response. I've heard from very few people, whether wrestling fans or not, who didn't enjoy the first episode. Those who have seen all or parts of most of the future shows say it only gets better. I was amazed at just how naive so many of those people were about what they were getting into. You think people whose lifetime dream would show up in the best condition possible. It was also funny that when Snow talked about the attributes they were looking for, he said most important was the physique. You know, most people, not everyone, but most people, with enough money for chemicals and decent dedication can get a good physique. Admittedly, it is much harder for some than others, and people with tiny frames may be able to develop a nice physique, nor can short people become tall, and thus may never have the size that WWF is looking for. Mental toughness and drive is a lot more difficult a commodity to find in people and is a whole lot more important, although when looking at someone, you can't see the size of someone's drive. Obviously, of the 230 people brought in, for making the show entertaining, they probably on purpose imported a few of the most out of shape and goofiest people looking for comedy. Still, I had to wonder about the 2,200 people who didn't even make the first cut based on those who got invited. As it turned out, the guy I thought from the first show was going to win only lasts a few weeks before he finds out the travel schedule and decides it's not for him. Here I am thinking that if I wanted to be a pro wrestler so bad I would go in, not only in as good a shape as possible, but not do these horrible in-character promos, and more importantly, know enough about wrestling to know what the road schedule is. Can you imagine if they held tryouts for SportsWriter and people showed up not knowing that 6 points were awarded for a touchdown,
or that never bothered learning how to type or didn't realize that if they were covering Major League Baseball, you would have to go on the road for 81 games.
Among the indie guys spotted among the 230 were Psycho Sam Dudley, Danny Rose, Sean Payne, Marty Garner, and Robert McCarthy, none of whom even made the first cut.
It was pretty clear they didn't want anyone who had much in the way of training to wrestle, because it would have made first stages of training less entertaining with a ringer in there. I think Taz almost made himself a cult hero by yelling at the more clueless people out there. Taz wasn't actually around for much of the training, which was largely handled by Snow, who also came across great on the first episode. My feeling on this is that the winners will likely be over pretty good in that fully everyman type of appeal for about a few weeks, because I think the show is going to do well among wrestling fans. Unfortunately, they won't have the experience to handle a push, so that appeal is going to be very short-lived. If they do have an aptitude and make it in OVW or wherever, by the time they get back, their appearance on the show will largely be forgotten. This is not the first time something like this has been done. In around 1969, promoter Jerry Seltzer commissioned a movie about roller derby during its heyday. The filming was turning into a disaster as the outside producers felt a movie about life in roller derby was just not that interesting. So they redid the project about the struggles of a guy who tries to make it in roller derby, and the movie got major critical acclaim. Don't ask me why. I thought it was boring. The skater, Mike Snell, was pushed real hard the next year during his rookie year as the star of the movie Derby, and there was a ton of resentment for his push because he hadn't paid his dues and got in easy. As it turned out, some veterans took extra liberties with him and he didn't last long before quitting. Also, he wasn't over a lick even though he was a star, because the fans saw he didn't have it pretty quickly. SmackDown notes from the June 21st show. Thought it was an overall pretty good show. Did better at building the pay-per-view, although when it was over, it was Undertaker vs. Page that seemed like the main event, and Benoit and Jericho just seemed like extras in a weird soap opera with McMahon and Austin. They did a good job in the opening core promo of getting the story across, but it's the first thing they had really done for the tournament. Having just the semis and finals and 4 guys, and only one of whom was really an established single star, made it seem such a letdown compared to the hype in prior years. Unlike in other years, I think the tournament won't mean a thing selling the show, and whatever it does, if it does decent, is due to Taker vs. Page and Austin and Vince, and I'm not that confident in the former, even though I think the SmackDown segment came off well. Tag title change was a good match, and X Factor vs. Kane and Hardy's was also good, with actually super crowd heat when Kane made his comeback on Albert. That's a good sign. It seemed that while they couldn't sell out Orlando, that those who were there were very into the product. Have to give WWF credit for editing a lot of the verbiage calling WCW a second-rate product out of Undertaker's interview before it aired. Access Hollywood ran one of those stories that WWF surely can't consider under the category "Ain't publicity is good publicity." It was called SmackDown Blues, talking about the ratings decline in WWF programming. Host Pat O'Brien implied the problem was because The Rock was gone. Not that it isn't a small part of the reason, but it is only a small part. He said ratings for SmackDown are tumbling, which is true, but that's like death as a word, because perception of tumbling ratings in the media creates a bigger tumble because lots of people don't like supporting what is perceived as something on its way down. The story said the ratings are only going to get worse in the fall, with new episodes of Friends, Survivor, and Temptation Island being on Thursdays. WWF sent Stephanie McMahon as their spokesperson. O'Brien noted the ratings drop of Raw since moving to TNN. Actually, ratings fell from 5.6 to 5.4 the week of the switch, and dropped after the move, although the 5.4 admittedly was a hotshot rating as opposed to normal levels. The move to TNN probably legit hurt them about 0.4, the rest of the drop has nothing to do with the move. Stephanie said it is harder for their fans to find the show on TNN, good grief. Almost all of them found it the first week. Now they can't find it. Like a big drop was after WrestleMania. Like that finish with Austin siding with Vince was so traumatic to WWF fans that 1 in 4 viewers has now developed amnesia. 2. Stephanie brought up the cyclical nature of wrestling, and you have to adapt and keep up with the audience. They hoped Tough Enough would help turn things around, and noted the show got rave reviews. She was asked why they bought WCW, and she said it was a great opportunity and would be a main focus of storylines. They aired a clip of Rock saying that he'd juggle movies and wrestling as long as he can. What is something important to note is that every TV show on average is significantly dropping in ratings over the past year. The 6 networks comparing last week to the same week last year were down 12%. SmackDown was down 30%, so you can blame some of the SmackDown drop on people not watching as much television, but most of it on people not watching as much wrestling on television. Due to the drop in price of WWFE stock, Vince McMahon is no longer listed in the Forbes list of the richest men in the United States. In the last listing in August of 2000, he was listed as being worth $1.1 million. Today he's down to $700 million. A correction to something on Observer Live last week.
I mentioned Benoit in WCW once lost 8 or 9 pay-per-view matches in a row.
At no point did he ever lose more than 5 in a row. WWF pulled Palumbo and O'Hare, but not Chavo Jr., from the UPW show on June 26, so they can be in MSG for SmackDown, I'm presuming. UPW show the same night switched to a main event where Chavo Jr. formed a tag team with his father, Chavo Sr., now 51, and Mondo, who is about the same age, against local heel Samoa Joe and Mikey Henderson and Damian Steele. Shelton Benjamin will be out 6 to 8 weeks as an MRI showed a torn ligament in his elbow. He's missing the June 27 Last Dance show, which was scheduled to be his highest-profile career match where he and Brock Lesnar were to defend the Southern Tag titles against Saturn and Malenko. On Win Ben Stein's Money this past week, a question was, name one of the founders of the WWF? The answer they were looking for was either Vince McMahon Jr. or Linda. I don't even know what the real answer would be. I guess Vince Sr. and Toots Mond if we're talking about the WWF name, or just Vince Sr. if you talk about the elimination of the third W. Raw was once again not the #1 rated show on cable on June 11, was USA Network's presentation of The Waterboy Place First. After the threats of a class action lawsuit by former XFL assistant coaches, the WWFE will continue to pay all assistants their full salaries and keep up their benefits through May 31, 2002. The coaches a few weeks ago had received a letter saying they would no longer be under contract after May 31, 2001.
Several of them got together and threatened a lawsuit, which caused
WWFE to extend the contracts another year.
This affects between 50 and 60 assistants, as WWFE and the 8 head coaches had already reached settlements on deals.
The coaches threatened suit because most coaching positions in football are filled between December and February, and the timing of the folding of the league would mean few would have a chance to hook up with a new job in football until the end of this year. Shane McMahon has apparently been suggesting giving Test an unbelievable push. AJ Styles gets a tryout on July 9 in Atlanta. On the Rec Sports video chart, WM17 fell to number 2 behind a NASCAR video, but WWF still dominated, with 6 of the top 10 and 11 of the top 20 tapes. However, wrestling's domination is starting to erode as besides WWF, only an ECW tape at number 18 made the list, which now has several skateboarding and auto racing tapes. SmackDown tapings June 19 in Orlando drew 8,506, paying $276,988. Trenton, New Jersey on June 23 for a house show drew 4,239, paying $146,930. Raw in Madison Square Garden on June 25 drew a sellout 15,734, which was 13,763, paying $450,138. We don't have the merchandise figures for MSG at press time, but for Orlando and Trenton, it came out to $6.48 per head, continuing the declining trend. Trenton was headlined by a cage match for the IC title with Kane beating Show by escaping the cage. Foley also worked the show as referee, costing Regal a European title match against Matt Hardy. A lot of the big names were given the night off so they could be fully rested for the pay-per-view. With the exception of Rhino, nobody in a key spot on the pay-per-view was even booked on the card. Trenton was originally booked to be the debut taping of the WCW TV when it was going to appear on Saturday night, and I guess WWF felt they needed to run the date after booking it, because they don't like to run house shows the night before a pay-per-view generally. The Reader's Pages. Broken Glass. I've been a wrestling fan for 15 years, and I've also worked in the glass industry for about the same length of time. Apart from some very minor cuts and about 3 weeks of discomfort from having glass in my eye, I've been fortunate to never receive a serious injury. I've witnessed and heard about some terrible injuries, including one colleague that had a sheet of glass break wrong and hit him in the face, causing a 6-inch area of skin to flap open, and needed 250 micro stitches to close up. Another colleague had glass break, cutting his wrist, which was severed 3/4 of the way through. Very unpleasant indeed. To see someone as talented as Kurt Angle anywhere near a spot with breaking of glass, yeah, absolutely mind-boggling. Whoever was responsible should be ashamed of themselves. It's bad enough that wrestlers with no talent stoop to these extremes, but someone like Angle should be protected from this sort of garbage wrestling. Chris Jones. WCW vs. WWF Angle.
DDP as the stalker kind of makes sense, and it isn't as disappointing as it could have been. But the WCW WWF angle is doomed to fail. Here is why. 1. Much like the NWO versus WCW angle, it may provide an initial spike in the ratings. But the long term of the feud killed WCW. They never ever got the big clean win back over the NWO. Okay, if Starrcade 1997 was booked differently, this might have changed things. But what would have happened to the NWO afterwards? The problem was, you had to keep both organizations strong or one would look weak. So if WWF loses to WCW in a bunch of matches next month, WWF will look bad. So what is more likely is a bunch of screw job endings and countless run-ins, much like the WCW versus NWO feud, which ends up making fans indifferent to the product. It's hard to watch a main event, like Starrcade 98 and 99, and boy did WCW ever blow those shows, when you know the big match is going to end in a screw job, wasting both your time and money. 2. A war with WCW will hurt the WWF lower card storylines. I noticed this watching WCW versus NWO, especially at the beginning. It was hard to get behind an angle on WCW Saturday night when at every commercial break, they were hyping up the most important battle in the history of wrestling. After hearing that, who could care about a Mongo versus Joe Gomez feud? Okay, nobody would have cared about that one anyway, but you get the point. 3. The WCW versus NWO angle seemed to transcend the whole face/heel setup of WCW. This was good at first, but seemed to screw up storylines later. What's going to happen when Chris Jericho is giving a face promo for WWF over WCW, then 2 minutes later, Vince does the same thing? I remember Steve Regal cutting face promos on WCW Saturday Night for WCW, which made no sense. How did they expect us to get behind this guy we've been programmed to boo? All the WCW wrestlers were presented in WWF as faces running in to attack heels, meaning we should cheer WCW. But DDP is a heel. Should we now hate WCW? This angle is too important for shades of gray. 4. WCW first needs to be rebuilt. What I remember most about WCW over the last year were blown spots by guys who weren't ready for TV, horrible TV production, horrible angles, and guys like Lex Luger and Buff Bagwell who were going through the motions. What has been done since that time to change that perception? Shane dancing around like a goof doesn't help. 5. As with anything in WWF, and now WCW, the McMahons will get involved and push wrestling to the background. My worst fear is this will come down to Vince versus Shane in a bunkhouse match. 6. The die-hard WCW fans who stuck it out to the bitter end aren't going to watch the new WCW, because more than likely it will look like the WWF product. At least in the old WCW. They pushed cruiserweights and it was something different. You always got a couple of good matches with guys working their asses off. The people who did watch WCW sure aren't watching WWF, and I doubt they're coming back. If this was done smart, WCW would get television and be built back up. Then they would build to a monster crossover pay-per-view in the early part of next year. They need to get WCW on its own, without using WWF as a rub. Even without Goldberg, there is enough talent in WCW to get people interested. Jeff Boothroyd. Benoit Angle. Regarding the cage match between Angle and Benoit, I must admit I didn't enjoy the match at all. I just felt the match was a shining example of what is wrong with the WWF and wrestling in general, and especially ironic considering what happened to Rick Blade over the previous weekend. I'll start with the obvious. Benoit and Angle don't need to take the punishment they did to put on a good match. However, it was clear they had to take the punishment they did to get any sort of a reaction from the crowd. The lack of a pop for the German suplex off the top rope could either be attributed to the fact it was brought out too early in the match, or that it just didn't seem like a big deal move to an audience desensitized by the oversaturation of ladder matches and table matches this year on television. After the moonsault off the cage and 9 German suplexes in a row, it came across to me as being desperation to pop the crowd. Like you wrote, they did too much in one match, and I just couldn't get into it. I also felt that while the 3 huge spots in the match were by themselves spectacular, they didn't fit into the match very well. I think it's sad when something that big, like a German suplex off the top rope, is used as something other than a finisher or at least a build to the finish. The fact Angle wasn't finished after all those German suplexes in a row seemed silly to me. Even though the 9 German suplexes finally got the crowd to react, I didn't see it as a good thing in the long run. I fear Benoit will be made into a one-trick pony of sorts, if that is what he has to do to get people to cheer. It also wasn't too bright to put Benoit in this type of a match after all the punishment he's taken in recent weeks.
and Angle as well. This is no time to start having your main eventers get injured when they are already considered by fans as the backups for the real main eventers that are out of action like Rock and Triple H. Like you said, the work can't be denied. I give credit to both for having a set of balls, but I find it hard to call the match a good match. It was representative of so many things I feel aren't good for wrestling, the workers and the business in general. At the same time, the two were gutsy, but I think they were also a little foolish. I enjoy stiff matches and big spots, but I think a line should be drawn somewhere, for the good of everyone. You wrote, I just hope they hype the hell out of those spots and try to push it to get both guys over on SmackDown and over the next week or two because those top of the cage spots are too high risk for simply one forgotten pop. While it's true using those clips over and over may get them over more, is it possible it could lead the fans to expect more of this type of action from Benoit and Angle? Could it lead to further desensitization of the WWF crowd, which is already shamefully hard to impress? You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Todd DePalma. Hart. I was very interested in Ellie Hart's letter in the June 11th Observer. Ms. Hart may object to your observation that the Hart family has issues and that the whole situation is sad, but just reading her letter brought me near tears thinking about all the tragedies that have happened to this family over the years. The wounds will never heal with all the finger pointing and manipulation that have gone on far too long. No doubt they have issues, as all families do. Only the people involved know what goes on behind closed doors, but I find it sad that this war is being fought in the pages of The Observer and is being used on WWF programming. The claim was that their appearance on Raw was to mend fences. While I hope it brought some peace to Stu and his family, doing the Montreal replay did nothing but rub more salt in the wounds. Ellie closed her letter with a line of telling Brett to get over Montreal. As you said, everyone needs to get over Montreal. Vince McMahon recreating that finish did nothing to bring anyone to that end. I wasn't fortunate to know Owen Hart, but from what little I've been able to learn about him, it is so apparent his family meant more to him than anything. How ironic that in his death, he is being used as a pawn in a game that can have no winners. There are only victims, and to continue to exploit this tragedy as a part of a cheap angle is reprehensible. Michelle Malbouf. I just got the second Bret Hart interview from RF Video. After seeing both the Hart and Michaels videos, I can definitely say there are two sides to every story. The Truth and Shawn Michaels. For example, Shawn said such things as 1. The clique had no power in the WWF. 2. He and Scott Hall came up with the idea of the ladder match. 3. They liked Shane Douglas. 4. Countless obscenities about Montreal. Hart's interview is much better and is clearly honest. I found one story particularly funny. When he and Vince first met in the park, Vince was scared to the point that Bret would kill him right there in broad daylight. Vince was mic'd and had the conversation taped. He also had hired a Secret Service team to surround Bret in case he pulled a gun on him. Josh Libanow. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,